Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was an ordinary afternoon when I first noticed something was off. I was driving home from work, the kind of day that doesn't stand out in any way. Just a regular Tuesday, and I was in my usual routine stuck in traffic, my eyes fixed on the road. My car was an older model, nothing too fancy, but it had this one new feature that was supposed to make my life easier. A GPS system. I didn't really give it much thought until it started doing things I couldn't explain. Now, let me back up a little and introduce myself. I'm just a regular guy. I work at night, spend my weekends with friends, and enjoy the occasional trip to the countryside. Nothing out of the ordinary about me, or so I thought. But there was one thing I'd always been known for: my love for gadgets. Whether it was the latest smartphone, a new app, or some techie feature in my car, I was all in. It was the perfect excuse for me to get a little distracted, especially when I didn't have much else on my mind. But like I said, nothing special about me or my life. Until that day. It was around 5 p.m., and I had just finished my shift at work. The sun was still out, casting long shadows across the streets, and the usual hum of evening traffic surrounded me. My car was moving at a crawl as usual. I was used to it. My mind was wandering, thinking about dinner, what I was going to do the next day, and the Netflix series I had been watching. It was just another day in the life of a city commuter. But something about the stillness of the moment made me feel a bit on edge. Perhaps it was the soft hum of the engine, or maybe the tiredness settling in my bones. Whatever it was, it felt like the perfect environment for something strange to happen. And little did I know, something was about to change. As I was heading home, I glanced at my GPS for directions. It had a sleek design, modern, touch screen, and efficient. I had just upgraded it a couple of months ago, and it had worked like a charm. It wasn't the kind of system that demanded my attention, always guiding me smoothly, providing the usual notifications about upcoming turns or delays. But on this evening, as I glanced down, the screen flickered briefly, just a moment of static, but enough to make me raise an eyebrow. I thought nothing of it. Probably just the sun hitting it weird, I told myself. The traffic around me was typical for this time of day, cars, bumper to bumper, a long stretch of concrete that seemed endless. It was one of those times when you start thinking that you might be stuck there forever. As I sat there, staring at the road ahead, I absent-mindedly fiddled with the GPS. It was more for the sound of my fingers tapping against the screen than anything else. Suddenly, it buzzed. A notification on the screen popped up, but it wasn't a typical traffic update. The route wasn't directing me toward home. No, it had changed directions completely. The GPS had a message on it that simply read, "Turn left." Now, that wasn't right. I wasn't anywhere near a turn, and definitely not one where I needed to veer off my normal path. Confused, I checked again, but the message was still there, insistent. I looked up at the road, no intersections for miles. It made no sense. The city was busy, full of lights and sounds, yet the GPS was telling me to turn left into what seemed like open space. It was almost like it was directing me toward a place that didn't exist. I let out a frustrated sigh, tapping the screen to cancel the direction. Must be a glitch, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. But as I pressed the cancel route button, nothing happened. The screen froze, the map stubbornly displaying that single instruction, turn left. My heart skipped a beat. I tapped harder, more frantically this time, trying to get the GPS to respond, but the screen didn't budge. It was stuck. The left turn that didn't make any sense was now the only option it was giving me. This wasn't just a malfunction. There was something wrong here, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I checked my surroundings, expecting to see an oncoming turn, a new street, anything that might explain what the GPS was trying to tell me. But all I saw was the endless stretch of concrete, with the taillights of the car in front of me gleaming faintly in the late afternoon light. After a few moments of confusion, I began to laugh it off. Maybe I'm just overtired, I told myself. Or maybe it's just a software update messing with me. I adjusted the GPS again, hoping it would snap out of whatever glitch it had fallen into. Still, the same message. My thumb hovered over the reset button, but just as I was about to press it, something unexpected happened. The GPS switched again without me touching it. The screen blinked to life and shifted, now showing a new route. It wasn't just a detour, it was completely different from the path I was on. And that's when I realized it wasn't just trying to get me home anymore. It was guiding me somewhere else. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. What was going on? The GPS didn't show any new directions, not in the way I was used to seeing them. It didn't give me the usual information. No street names, no distances. Just a single word flashing on the screen. Destination. The screen zoomed in, focusing on a dark, eerie location. A place that was nowhere near the area I lived or worked. It was off the grid. Something about that word, destination, didn't feel right. I paused, staring at the screen. My mind raced. Was this some kind of joke? Was I being pranked? But no, the screen was too serious. Too real. It took me a while to process it all, but I was beginning to feel that this wasn't a glitch anymore. This was intentional. Something had taken control of my GPS, and it was taking me somewhere I couldn't even begin to understand. But even though my instincts were screaming at me to stop, the GPS kept guiding me, its eerie, silent instructions more pressing with each passing second. And that's when I knew, for the first time in my life, that I was no longer in control of my car. The silence in the car was palpable, save for the occasional hum of the engine and the rhythmic tapping of my fingers against the steering wheel. I stared at the GPS screen, still fixated on that word, destination. It seemed so absurd to me. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. What kind of glitch could cause something like this? It didn't make sense. And yet, there it was, a blinking red dot on the map that didn't belong. I glanced around at the cars around me. Everyone else seemed oblivious to what was unfolding in my own vehicle. They were just stuck in their own mundane world of traffic, waiting for the light to change, scrolling on their phones, or lost in their own thoughts. But here I was, locked in a battle with a GPS that was slowly leading me off my usual route somewhere that felt wrong. My eyes flicked back to the screen. It was showing a winding road, one I didn't recognize. My house was nowhere in sight. There were no familiar landmarks, no street names to anchor me to the reality I knew. I pressed the reset button again, hoping the screen would return to normal. But it didn't. Come on, what's going on? I muttered under my breath, frustration mounting as I tapped the screen repeatedly. Nothing. No response. I looked around again, a strange sense of isolation creeping in. I was still in the middle of the city. This couldn't be happening. I should have been heading home by now. My eyes darted between the road ahead and the GPS screen, as if I were waiting for it to reveal a clue. Anything that would make sense of what I was experiencing. The car ahead of me moved forward, and I followed without thinking, turning down a street I passed 100 times before. But this time, something felt different. The GPS began to recalibrate, the screen shifting with the subtle hum of its mechanics. The voice came on, sharp and clear. Continue straight for 2 miles. I blinked, surprised at how calmly it spoke. Something about the tone was unnerving. It was too clear, too deliberate, as though it was aware of more than it should be. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the system was guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. I drove for another mile, tension coiling in my stomach, my hands tightening around the steering wheel. But then, just as I was about to dismiss the whole thing as a weird coincidence, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure on the sidewalk. A man, standing still. His face was obscured by the shadows of a nearby tree, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood there, unmoving, just watching my car as I passed. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved, hadn't even seemed to blink. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled in my chest. Just a guy out for a walk, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just being paranoid. Something about the figure had been off. He hadn't seemed human in the way he stood, as if he were too aware of my every move. And just like that, The strange unease grew. I tried to focus on the road, but the further I drove, the more unsettled I became. Every passing street sign, every turn seemed wrong, out of place. I couldn't recognize the names of the streets, and even the sounds of the city faded as if the world around me was being swallowed whole. The normal noise of the bustling metropolis honking horns, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter was replaced by an eerie stillness, like the city itself had fallen into a strange silence. Another mile passed, and I found myself in an unfamiliar area. I knew I should have turned around by now, but for some reason, I didn't. I couldn't. The GPS was leading me forward, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt compelled to follow it. My thumb hovered over the screen, wanting to press cancel, wanting to stop this madness. But I didn't. Instead, the GPS instructed me to take another turn, this time onto a narrow alleyway, tucked between two buildings. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't right. No GPS I'd ever used would send me down a route like this. It wasn't even a road. It was more like a forgotten passageway that only someone with ill intentions would know about. I ignored my better judgment and turned down the alley. The moment I did, the streetlights above flickered and went out, one by one, casting the world around me in darkness. It was so sudden, so absolute, that for a moment I thought the entire city had gone dark. But the GPS continued, guiding me further into the alley, its calm voice repeating the same phrase over and over. Continue forward. I felt my heart race as the alley grew narrower. The buildings on either side loomed over me, casting long, oppressive shadows across the car. The only light now came from my headlights, and the farther I went, the more I could feel the weight of something watching me, waiting. I shook my head, trying to shake off the mounting sense of dread. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. This was just a malfunctioning GPS system, and I needed to turn around. I slammed my foot on the brake and reached for the reset button, but before I could press it, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks. A soft tapping against my window. My stomach dropped. I slowly turned my head, my eyes locking onto the window beside me. I couldn't see much in the dark, but I could make out the shape of something or someone just outside the car. I couldn't tell if it was a person, a figure, or something else entirely, but whatever it was moving. I froze. I wanted to scream, but the air felt thick, suffocating. My breath hitched in my chest, and I turned my eyes back to the road, trying to ignore the tapping. Just go. Just go, I whispered under my breath, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than ever. But the tapping continued, faster now, and it was joined by something else, a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the sound of a machine working beneath the surface. Then, the GPS screen flickered again. A new message appeared. Destination reached. I stared at it, too stunned to process the words. Destination reached? How could that be? I hadn't even made it anywhere, at least nowhere I recognized. I was still in the alley, with nothing but darkness and the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. The tapping stopped. The hum faded. And in that silence, I finally did what I should have done the moment this all started. I hit the gas. The car jolted forward, and I didn't look back. I don't know how long I drove. I just kept going, my hands gripping the wheel like my life depended on it. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest, and the GPS had gone silent. No more directions. No more instructions. Nothing. It was as though the system had gone completely dead. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. It wasn't until I reached a well-lit street, a familiar part of the city, that I allowed myself to slow down. I looked at the GPS again, but this time, there was nothing, just a blank screen. My hands were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. What had just happened? What had that been? The sound of my heartbeat was deafening in the quiet of the car. I looked around, trying to reassure myself that I was back in control, that everything was fine now. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That feeling of being watched, the sense that something had been guiding me not to a destination, but into something darker, still clung to me. The drive home should have been a relief, but every turn, every street I passed, felt like a reminder of the nightmare I had just narrowly escaped. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, the strange, oppressive silence that had enveloped the alley. and that sense of dread that lingered even now. It was as though something was still following me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I pulled into the driveway, but as I sat there, engine idling, I hesitated. Something in me told me to leave the car running, to not shut it off. My mind was spinning, and my hands were trembling on the wheel. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't let this consume me. I had to regain control. I forced myself to get out of the car. The air outside was cool, and the faint sound of crickets chirping in the distance did little to calm the racing thoughts in my mind. I walked to the front door, every step feeling heavier than the last. I opened the door, and the house felt colder than usual. There was no reason for it. Nothing was different. But in my mind, everything had changed. I tried to convince myself it was just the stress, the tension from that strange drive. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Inside, I walked straight to the kitchen, hoping the familiar scent of coffee and the hum of the refrigerator would help ground me. But it didn't. There was a strange heaviness in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I needed to talk to someone. I couldn't be the only one who felt it, the weirdness, the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. But who could I call? Who would believe me? I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, but stopped before dialing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I just needed sleep. I tossed the phone on the counter and went to the living room. As I sat down, the weight of everything settled on me, and my body started to relax, even if my mind wasn't. That's when it happened. The soft, unmistakable sound of a notification pinged from my phone. I turned toward it, my eyes narrowing. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have gone there." My stomach dropped, a cold wave of fear washing over me. The phone buzzed again, another message. "I told you to turn around." I stared at the words, disbelief mingling with terror. How could someone know what had happened? How could anyone possibly know about the alley? My fingers shook as I reached for the phone, staring at the screen in a daze. I almost didn't want to reply, but I had to. The fear bubbling up inside me was too much to ignore. I typed, "Who is this?" The phone buzzed again. "You're already too deep." The text felt like a punch to the gut. The sense of isolation I had felt before was now replaced by a sickening feeling of being trapped, like I was part of something much bigger than I had realized. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was this happening? The jeepus, the figure in the alley, the strange messages, none of it made sense. And yet, I couldn't ignore it. It was like I had been dragged into something, pulled into a world that wasn't supposed to be real. I couldn't just sit here. I couldn't let this thing control me. I grabbed the phone again and, with trembling hands, texted, "What do you want from me?" For a moment, there was nothing. I stared at the screen, waiting. But then the phone vibrated again. "You'll understand soon enough. It's not over." The words felt like a death sentence. I dropped the phone onto the couch beside me, unable to look at it any longer. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. I could feel the walls of the room closing in on me, the silence pressing in from all sides. It was suffocating. I stood up abruptly, pacing the living room, my mind racing. I had to figure out what was going on. This wasn't just a random glitch, a malfunction. There was something more to it. The figure, the alley, the text messages, there was a connection between them, something I hadn't yet understood. I glanced at the clock. It was too late, but I couldn't just let this go. I had to go back. I had to see the alley again. Maybe it was just a bad dream, some twisted hallucination brought on by stress. But if there was even a chance that something was really going on, I had to find out. I had to go back to the place where it all started. With a deep breath, I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face as I walked to my car, the night feeling impossibly still, almost unnaturally quiet. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I got in the car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. The streets were empty. The usual traffic was gone, and the familiar hum of the city seemed distant, muted. I drove in silence, my mind still whirling with questions, doubts, and fears. What had I gotten myself into? As I neared the area, my pulse quickened. I knew exactly where I was going, the alley. I had to go back, had to see it with my own eyes, figure out what had happened. But when I turned the corner, I didn't see the alley. It was gone. I slowed down, staring at the space where it should have been. The road was just a regular street now, lined with homes and shops. There was nothing unusual about it. The alley, the path the GPS had led me to, was nowhere to be found. I sat there, frozen. My hand hovered over the steering wheel, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? I turned the car around, determined to find another way in. There had to be something. As I drove, I glanced at the GPS, but it was just showing me the normal roads now. No red dots, no winding paths. I could almost hear the quiet laugh of the system, mocking me for my futile search. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something in the distance, a shadow. I turned my head sharply, and there it was, just as I had seen it earlier. The figure, standing motionless by the side of the road. But this time, there was no mistaking it. It was closer, much closer. My heart stopped. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and my foot slammed down on the gas pedal, desperate to get away. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I didn't look back as I sped down the road, my hands shaking violently. Whatever this was, it was real. It wasn't just in my head. I had been drawn into something far beyond my understanding, and there was no escaping it now. The messages, the figure, the GPS, it all had a purpose. I wasn't just a random victim. No, I was part of something much bigger. And I had no idea how deep I had already gone. I didn't know how long I had been driving, my eyes glued to the road, heart hammering in my chest, fear clawing at my throat. My breath was ragged as I navigated the streets, my mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios, none of them making sense. The figure was still out there, somewhere. And the GPS? The damn GPS was still alive, guiding me, pulling me into this twisted game with no escape. I had to stop. I couldn't keep going. I was exhausted, drained, and at the mercy of something I didn't understand. But then it happened again. The notification pinged from my phone. My stomach lurched as I grabbed it, almost too terrified to check it. You're getting close. I didn't want to. I didn't want to go any further, but the message was like a siren's call, pulling me deeper. There was something about it, the way it was phrased, the way it made me feel that I couldn't resist. I had to see this through. I had to know what was happening, even if it killed me. I turned onto another side street, the familiar comfort of my own neighborhood slipping away as I entered unfamiliar territory. The streets were darker here, almost completely deserted, as though the entire world had decided to retreat into shadows. The air felt different, heavy, oppressive. I felt like I was being watched from every direction. The GPS led me further down a narrow, almost hidden lane. It didn't make sense, but I followed it. As I turned the corner, my headlights illuminated something unexpected, an old, decrepit building, its windows shattered and its doors hanging off their hinges. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't seen life in years. My heart stopped for a second as I recognized it. The place was familiar. I had seen it before, not in person, but in the reflection of my rearview mirror. The figure, the one that had been watching me earlier, it was here now. I knew it. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt right in front of the entrance. The headlights flickered, as if even the car itself was reluctant to be there. The figure was standing just inside the doorway. I could see it now more clearly, though it was still mostly hidden in the darkness. Tall, impossibly still, just watching. It didn't move. A cold chill ran down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get back in the car and never look back. But I couldn't. I wasn't sure why, but there was a pull, a magnetic force that kept me rooted to the spot. My hands gripped the wheel as if that would anchor me, but the feeling of being trapped, helpless, only grew stronger. The phone buzzed again, pulling me from my thoughts. Another text, another warning. You're not supposed to be here. I could feel the sweat gathering on my forehead, my pulse quickening with every word. This wasn't just a game. It wasn't some twisted joke. I had stumbled into something, and I was already too deep. There was no way out now. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the figure had not moved. It was as if it was waiting for something waiting for me. Something deep inside me told me that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. Not anymore. I slowly opened the car door, the metallic sound of it scraping against the pavement, seeming unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the night. Every step I took toward the building felt like a step closer to my doom. But I had to go. I had to know. What was it that was calling me here? The air grew colder the closer I got to the door. I could feel it, the weight of the unknown pressing in on me. My breath came out in shallow gasps, a cloud of vapor disappearing into the night. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling, and pulled it open with a creak that echoed through the silence. And that's when it hit me. The smell. It wasn't just the usual scent of decay that you might expect from an abandoned building. No, this was different. It was thick, cloying, like wet earth mixed with something far more sinister, something rotten. The smell choked me, made my stomach turn. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. My footsteps seemed to echo in the vast emptiness, as though I was disturbing something that had been dormant for a long time. The air was thick, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching out at me like fingers. The figure had moved. It stood still, watching. But this time, I could see more. Its face, if you could even call it that, was obscured by a hood. But what little of it I could see, it was wrong. The skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over the bones. The eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were deep, hollow voids, like empty sockets, staring into my very soul. My blood ran cold. It was the same figure that had appeared in my rearview mirror, in my dreams, in my nightmares. I was too close now. There was no turning back. I took a step forward, then another. My heartbeat rang in my ears. I couldn't look away. Something in me wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I had no control anymore. The figure was reaching out to me, its arms long and unnaturally thin, like they didn't belong to any living being. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, a sound that vibrated deep inside my chest, it spoke. You shouldn't have followed. The words weren't spoken with any physical sound, but rather felt like a presence in my mind. The air seemed to thicken, and everything around me warped. My vision blurred, the walls of the building closing in, bending and distorting like a nightmare. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't listen to me. It was as if I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. I felt myself slipping into some kind of trance, a hypnotic state. The figure stepped forward, moving inhumanly slow, its limbs jerking at unnatural angles. It reached out, its bony fingers brushing against my cheek. The chill of its touch shot through me like ice, freezing my blood in my veins. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. There was no escape. The darkness had consumed me. I was trapped in this nightmare, this never-ending cycle of terror. The phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with a new message. It's too late. In that instant, everything clicked. The GPS, the text, the figure. I wasn't just following some random directions. I wasn't just lost in some twisted game. No, I was part of it. The very essence of this place, of this creature, was tied to me now. My fate was sealed, and there was nothing I could do to change it. I realized with growing horror that I had been drawn here for a reason, and I wasn't the first to fall into its trap. The figure, the thing before me, wasn't some random apparition. It was a part of this place, this cursed cycle, and now I was caught in it, bound by invisible strings I couldn't see but could certainly feel. And then it spoke again, its voice cold and final. You will not leave. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face as the darkness around me closed in. This was it. There was no escape now. I woke up, my body stiff and aching, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The darkness was still thick around me, but this time it didn't feel oppressive. It felt different, almost like I was floating in some strange, liminal space. I blinked several times, trying to focus, to gather myself. My breath came in shallow gasps, as I slowly pushed myself up, my hands bracing against the cold floor beneath me. Where was I? The air around me was damp and musty, the smell of mildew filling my nostrils. I glanced around, panic rising in my chest. The building, the decrepit structure that had been the scene of my nightmares, was gone. The walls were different now, smooth and sterile, almost hospital-like. The shadows that had once twisted into monstrous shapes now seemed harmless, benign. But there was a strange emptiness to the place, like it had been abandoned for years. I scrambled to my feet, the disorientation making my head spin. My eyes darted around, looking for some kind of clue as to where I was. The phone. Where was my phone? I had to check it. I had to know if there was still a trace of the madness I had just experienced. I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling as I pulled it out. The screen lit up, a familiar, soothing glow in the darkness. I tapped the home button, hoping, praying that the app would open normally, but it didn't. Instead, the screen flickered, the GPS app flashing to life with the same eerie map that had led me here, the same twisted, distorted roads, the same haunting red dot. My finger hovered over the screen as the text message notification appeared again, a chilling reminder of the horrors that had come before. You're still here. A shiver ran down my spine. The words were so simple, yet they held a weight I couldn't ignore. They didn't just mean that I was still in this place. They meant something far worse, something that gnawed at my sanity. Whatever had happened to me, whatever had been unleashed during that nightmarish journey, was far from over. I looked up from my phone, scanning the room again, trying to understand where I was. The building still felt wrong, its sterile, unnatural design clashing with the sense of wrongness that lingered in the air. But there was no sign of the figure, no trace of the thing that had been watching me, guiding me, controlling me. Had it all been some kind of illusion? A nightmare brought to life by my own fear? My rational mind screamed that it must have been. But my heart told me that it was still here, still lingering just beyond the edges of my vision, ready to come back. The silence pressed in on me. It was too quiet. I wasn't sure how long I'd been here, how long I'd been unconscious, trapped in this bizarre place, but the weight of it was overwhelming. I had no answers. I had no explanation for what had happened. I only knew one thing. I needed to leave. I turned and stumbled toward the door, my legs still unsteady beneath me, but the pull to escape was undeniable. The further I moved, the more oppressive the silence became. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, like I was being swallowed up by the very building. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, but the door of the exit was closed. Just a few more steps. I reached the door and grasped the handle. My fingers tightened around it, desperate for freedom, desperate to get out of this nightmare. I yanked it open, and the cold, damp air hit me like a slap in the face. The world outside was different. It wasn't the same place I remembered. The streets were unfamiliar, twisted in a way that didn't make sense. The buildings were old, crumbling, their windows dark and lifeless. It felt like I was in a world that had been abandoned, forgotten by time itself. And yet, I wasn't alone. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate, like someone or something was following me. I didn't dare turn around. I knew what I would see, and I couldn't bear it. My heart raced, panic surging as I took one step after another, moving faster now, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and whatever had been chasing me. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many turns I took, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the figure was still out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, I stumbled, tripping over something in the street, my body crashing to the pavement. Pain shot through me, but I didn't have time to recover. I pushed myself up, my hands scraping against the rough ground as I looked around, and that's when I saw it, the figure. It was standing across the street, just far enough away that I couldn't make out all the details, but close enough that I could feel the weight of its gaze. I froze, my body refusing to move, even as my mind screamed at me to run. But it didn't advance. It didn't get any closer. It just stood there, watching, Then, as if sensing my fear, it tilted its head slightly, almost as if it was studying me, waiting. The air grew heavier, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, the world around me freezing in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if I was locked in some kind of trance, unable to break free. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared, vanished into the night. The streets were silent once again. I wasn't sure what had just happened. Had it all been real? Was it just a hallucination brought on by my mind, shattered by fear and exhaustion? Or was there something far darker at play? I didn't have any answers. I didn't know what the figure was or what it wanted. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to find my way out. And so, I walked. Slowly at first, my feet dragging as I tried to gather my bearings. The world felt wrong, like it had been twisted out of shape, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself be consumed by it. I had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. Eventually, I found my way back to familiar streets. The streets I had once known. The streets that felt like home. But even then, the feeling of being watched lingered, a constant presence that I couldn't shake. As I walked through the quiet, empty streets, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to appear again. But it didn't. It was gone. But was it really gone? The phone buzzed again, the familiar ping vibrating in my pocket. I didn't want to look at it, but I had to. I pulled it out, dreading what I might see. The screen flashed. The same message. The same chilling words. You can't run forever. And that was it. There was no resolution. No final answer. Only more questions. I didn't know if I had escaped, or if I was still trapped in the nightmare, still at the mercy of whatever had been haunting me. I didn't know what would happen next. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. I couldn't rest. Because whatever was behind me, whatever had been chasing me, wasn't finished yet. It's been months since that night. Months since I stumbled out of that abandoned place, my body bruised, my mind shattered. I've tried to go back to some semblance of normal life. I've moved to a new city, changed my number, and even deleted every app on my phone, except the essentials. But every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something in old map, a flicker of red on a GPS screen, and it all comes rushing back. I don't think I'll ever truly be free from it. I still feel the presence. It's faint now, almost like a distant memory, but there are moments when it creeps in, uninvited. It might happen when I'm walking down a quiet street, or when I'm sitting alone in my car, parked under a street lamp, and I hear something rustling behind me. There are times when I reach for my phone, just to check the time, and a shiver races up my spine as I remember that app, the one that led me to those terrifying, unknown places. That app is gone now, wiped from my phone and my mind, but the fear lingers. It always lingers. I've done everything I can to avoid being sucked back into that nightmare, but I know deep down that it's never truly over. I can run, I can hide, but it will always find me. And that thought, that awareness, keeps me up at night. I can't shake the feeling that, no matter how far I go, it will always be there, waiting, following the trail of my fear like an invisible predator. Some people, when they hear about what happened to me, brush it off as a product of stress or my imagination playing tricks. They tell me that the mind can be a powerful thing, and that sometimes it creates these distortions in reality. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. It wasn't just the mind. It was something else. Something real. Something that was waiting for the right moment to pounce. The message on my phone. You can't run forever. Those words still echo in my ears, like a reminder that I will never truly be free of whatever it was that had taken control of my life. It didn't just disappear. No, that's the thing. Nothing like this ever disappears. It changes. It shifts, like water slipping through your fingers. But it's always there, lurking in the cracks of your mind, ready to come back when you least expect it. And I can't help but wonder, is it still out there? I look at my phone sometimes, half expecting to see that app reappear, to hear that same cold, mechanical voice guiding me to places I don't want to go. There's a part of me that wants to keep moving, to stay ahead of it. But the truth is, I'm exhausted. I'm tired of running. And if there's one thing I've learned, It's that there's nowhere to hide when it comes to things like this. Maybe I'm not meant to escape. Maybe this is how it ends. Maybe the chase will go on forever. But there's one thing I know for sure. I'm not the same person I was before. I can't be. Whatever I encountered that night, whatever it was that played with my mind and my reality, changed me. The world doesn't feel the same anymore. Everything feels fragile, as if the veil between what's real and what's not is thinner than I ever thought possible. I don't go to sleep easily anymore. And when I do, I keep the lights on. The shadows seem deeper, more menacing in the dark. Sometimes, just before I close my eyes, I hear a faint noise, something I can't quite place. It could be my imagination, or it could be something else, something I'm not ready to face. I guess, at the end of it all, I'll never really know what happened that night. I'll never fully understand what force, what presence, what malevolent thing pushed me to the brink of my sanity. But I know it's out there, and I know that even though I've left it behind, it hasn't left me. In the quiet moments, when the world slows down and everything is still, I think back on that GPS, on those eerie directions, on the places I visited against my will, and a cold shiver runs down my spine. This isn't your typical camping trip. At least, not how we imagined it at the beginning. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a weekend to clear our heads, relax, and enjoy the outdoors. A chance to escape from the daily grind of work, school, and life's constant demands. Little did we know that this trip would soon become something none of us would ever forget. It all started when I, along with 3 close friends, decided to head out into the woods for a camping trip. I'm not talking about a nice, easygoing campsite with amenities. This was a remote patch of land deep in the forest, far from civilization. My best friend, Daniel, had found the place online, a tucked-away spot that promised pristine wilderness and an experience far removed from the usual tourist traps. Just thinking about it now, the idea sounded perfect. Daniel was the organizer, the one who always made sure we were doing something interesting. He had this infectious enthusiasm for anything outdoors. Then there was Rob, the practical one, always prepared for whatever nature could throw at us. He didn't trust anything that wasn't mapped out or measured, and this trip was no different. He had enough gear packed to survive a month in the wilderness, though we'd only be there for a couple of nights. Then there was Olivia, the easygoing one. She was up for anything adventurous, yet calm, the kind of person who could get along with anyone. And finally, there was me, Luke. I've always been the quiet one in the group, often taking in the surroundings and letting others lead the way. I never saw myself as the risk taker, but this trip, I figured, would be a chance to push myself, enjoy nature, and maybe even get some much-needed rest from my busy life. We had been planning this trip for months, taking long drives out of the city just to check out potential spots, researching trail routes, and deciding on the best gear. Daniel was the driving force, keeping us all motivated. Rob, of course, was always skeptical, doubting the success of our plan. There's no cell service out there. What happens if something goes wrong? He'd ask, looking over his notes again and again. But Olivia and I were more excited than anything else. Come on, Rob, I'd say. It's just a weekend. What could possibly go wrong? We all laughed at his concerns, assuming he was just overthinking things like he always did. Our plan was simple. We'd drive up Friday afternoon, set up camp by evening, and spend the weekend hiking, fishing, and maybe telling some ghost stories around the fire at night. It sounded perfect. Nothing could go wrong. The day of the trip arrived, and we met up early in the morning to pack the car. Rob insisted we double-check the maps and weather forecast, as usual. It was a long drive, nearly 5 hours into the heart of the woods, far past any towns or civilization. The weather was crisp, the air fresh, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was the perfect day to get out and enjoy the outdoors. When we finally arrived, it was around mid-afternoon. We parked the car at the edge of a dense forest, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The area seemed untouched, wild, and free. We felt like we had entered a different world, one far removed from our daily routines. We could already tell this place was different from anywhere we camped before. The air had an eerie stillness to it. The trees were tall, their branches reaching up like silent, looming figures, their thick foliage blocking out most of the sunlight. "We're gonna have a blast here," Daniel said, his voice full of excitement as he opened the trunk and began pulling out camping gear. Rob wasn't so sure. He looked around, his face a little more tense than usual. "This place gives me the creeps. It feels off." But Daniel laughed it off, and we all followed him toward the campsite, setting up tents and preparing for the night. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, the forest grew darker, and we began to settle around the fire. Rob continued to express his unease. "There's something strange about this place. I read that the woods around here have a history. People used to vanish. There were rumors of strange happenings, even ghost stories tied to this forest." He paused, glancing nervously at the trees, which now seemed to shift in the growing darkness. Of course, Daniel dismissed it. "Come on, Rob. Stop trying to scare us. It's just an old forest with some tall tales." He reached for a log and threw it onto the fire, making the flames leap higher. The rest of us agreed with Daniel, brushing off Rob's concerns as nothing more than an overactive imagination. But as the night went on, something started to feel off. The air grew colder, and the crackling fire didn't seem to push away the chill. There was a sense of stillness and almost unnatural silence in the woods surrounding us. I remember looking around, feeling a little uneasy, but I told myself it was just the darkness settling in. That first night passed without incident. We told a few stories, laughed, and then went to bed, the sounds of the forest lulling us to sleep. But there was something about that place, something I couldn't shake. The first signs that something was wrong came when we woke up the next morning. It was a quiet morning, but not the kind of peaceful quiet I was expecting. The forest around us seemed unnaturally still, with no sounds from the usual morning birds or animals. The wind wasn't even stirring the leaves. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. As I opened my eyes and glanced at the others, I could see their faces were still relaxed in sleep, but something was different. There was a tension in the air I couldn't quite place, a feeling that we weren't alone in this place. I shook off the strange feeling and got up to make coffee. Rob was the first to stir. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair, looking a little more disheveled than usual. I noticed him glancing around, his brow furrowing as if he too had sensed something that wasn't right. He didn't say anything at first, but I saw him take a deep breath and start checking his gear. It was a small, almost unnoticeable reaction, but I knew him well enough to understand that he was uneasy. Daniel was still asleep, his arm draped over his face, blocking out the sun. Olivia was the last to wake, stretching and yawning before sitting up. "Morning," she said cheerfully, but there was a certain edge to her voice that suggested even she had noticed the odd atmosphere. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound normal. I was about to ask Rob if he was okay, but before I could, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like a distant knock. It didn't sound like anything natural. The wind wasn't blowing. No animals were stirring. It was just this strange, tapping sound coming from deeper in the woods. Rob stopped what he was doing and turned toward the source of the noise. The look on his face was unmistakable. He was trying to convince himself it was nothing, probably just a branch, he muttered under his breath, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a branch. There was something about the way the sound repeated, like it was too deliberate. It didn't fit the usual rhythm of the forest. Olivia's eyes were wide, and she looked at me, clearly sensing it too. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if she feared speaking too loudly would make the sound more real. I didn't answer. Instead, I tried to look as if I hadn't heard it, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and persistent. It felt like it was getting closer, inching toward us. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw Daniel finally sit up, his eyes scanning the trees with a concerned look. "What's going on?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "I don't know," I said, my voice low, "but I'm pretty sure we're not alone." Rob gave a small laugh, clearly trying to dismiss the feeling. "Guys, it's probably just some animal or wind, nothing to worry about." But even as he said it, his eyes kept darting toward the edge of the campsite, his posture stiff and alert. He wasn't fooling anyone. We all sat in silence for a while, each of us trying to ignore the tapping, but it was hard. It was like a shadow creeping over us, making everything feel wrong. The sound would stop for a moment, only to start again closer now. My nerves were starting to fray. I could hear my heartbeat, feel it thumping in my chest as I looked around. There was no logical reason for it, but I knew something was out there. "All right," Daniel said, standing up abruptly. "I'm going to check it out." "No way," Rob responded quickly. "We shouldn't go off alone in this place. We don't know what's out there." But Daniel wasn't the type to back down. "It's probably nothing. Just stay here. I'll be back in a minute." Before anyone could say anything else, Daniel grabbed his jacket and started walking toward the woods. I hesitated, my instincts telling me to stop him, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. We all stood there in silence, watching as he disappeared into the trees. The sound of his footsteps grew faint, replaced by the steady tapping, which was now louder than ever. It felt like time stretched as we waited. I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept looking at the trees, watching for any sign of movement. The quiet felt too deep, almost suffocating. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the tapping stopped. A heavy silence followed, and I glanced at Rob and Olivia. Rob was the first to speak. "This is a bad idea. We need to go check on him." Olivia, who had been unusually quiet, nodded. "I don't like this. It feels wrong." Without another word, we gathered our things quickly and made our way toward the edge of the woods where Daniel had gone. The trees were dense here, their branches tangled together, blocking out most of the sunlight. The path was uneven, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. We moved cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I kept glancing over my shoulder. It felt like something was following us, just out of sight. We called Daniel's name, but there was no answer. The deeper we went into the woods, the harder it was to hear anything. It was as if the forest itself was swallowing all sound. The only noise now was our own footsteps crunching the forest floor. After what felt like an eternity, we found him. He was standing in a small clearing, staring at something in front of him. His back was to us, and he didn't move as we approached. "Daniel?" I called out, my voice cracking. He didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, he turned around. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "You guys need to see this." We followed him to the spot where he had been standing. There, in the dirt, was a large stone. It was smooth and flat, but the strangest thing was the symbol carved into its surface. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before, an intricate pattern, almost like an ancient rune, etched deeply into the stone, as if it had been there for centuries. I looked at Rob, who had gone completely still. "What is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "But I swear I didn't touch it. It wasn't here before." We all stared at the stone for a long moment, unsure of what to make of it. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had only intensified. It was clear now that something wasn't right. Something ancient and possibly dangerous had been waiting for us in these woods, and we had just uncovered the first sign. The days that followed were a blur of unease, each one stretching into the next like an endless wave, crashing over us without any sign of relief. We couldn't ignore the stone or the strange markings we had found. But even more unsettling were the things that began happening, things that didn't fit into any logical explanation. After we returned to camp, we tried to act as though everything was normal, but it wasn't. Rob suggested we pack up and leave, but the idea of heading back so soon felt wrong, like admitting defeat. Besides, we hadn't yet figured out what the stone meant, and none of us could shake the feeling that there was more to this place than we had originally thought. The next morning, we decided to stay. We'd check the area again, maybe even take a trip further into the woods, but not too deep, just enough to see if we could uncover any more clues. But even as we packed our things and prepared for another day of exploration, the tension in the air was palpable. It was as if the forest itself was waiting for something. I remember the exact moment I first noticed it. The silence was so profound that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We were sitting around the campfire, eating our breakfast, when I heard a distant sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant engine running. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then Olivia looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You hear that?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent. We all froze, listening. The hum grew louder, then faded away, only to return in a series of brief pulses. It wasn't an engine. It was something else, something that vibrated through the air itself. "That's not normal," Rob muttered, standing up and scanning the trees. "Let's go check it out." As we began walking toward the source of the hum, I could feel my heart beating faster. The air felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The sounds of the forest had died down completely. There were no birds, no rustling leaves. It was as though the entire ecosystem had gone into hiding. The closer we got to the sound, the more unnerving it became. It wasn't coming from the direction we had originally thought. The hum was coming from deeper in the woods, just beyond a thick cluster of trees. Every time we thought we had pinpointed the location, it seemed to shift, moving further away, almost like it was toying with us. I felt a sense of dread build within me, but I didn't want to voice my fear. Rob, ever the skeptic, kept muttering under his breath, as if to reassure himself. But Daniel was quieter than usual, and Olivia, well, she was moving cautiously, her eyes scanning every corner of the dark forest around us. When we finally reached the area where we believed the sound was coming from, there was nothing. No hum. No sign of anything unusual. Just the trees, the damp earth, and the silence. We all exchanged glances, but no one said anything. We had become accustomed to this odd feeling that something was watching us, but whatever had been there before was gone, and that only made the unease worse. We stood there for a long while, each of us waiting for someone to speak. But then, Olivia let out a gasp. Her hand shot up, pointing toward something in the distance. "There," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. In the distance, just barely visible through the trees, was a figure. It wasn't clearly defined, but it was definitely there, tall, dark, and vaguely human-shaped. It stood motionless, as though waiting for us to notice. The sight of it made my blood run cold. "Is that?" Rob began, but he didn't finish. He couldn't. The figure had already started moving. It wasn't a person. At least, not like any person I had ever seen. It moved unnaturally jerky, stiff, like it was being controlled by something far beyond our understanding. It glided through the trees, each step precise and calculated, and we stood frozen, unable to move. It wasn't until the figure disappeared completely into the underbrush that any of us were able to react. "Did you see that?" Daniel finally asked, his voice hoarse. "I saw it," Olivia replied, her hands trembling at her sides. "What the hell was that?" We didn't speak for a long time after that. We couldn't. We didn't have the words. After a while, we made our way back to camp, moving more quickly than before. We hadn't come to any conclusions, but the feeling of being watched was more pronounced now than it had ever been. The air was thick, and the tension between us was suffocating. Every rustle in the trees made us jump. Every snap of a twig sent our hearts racing. We tried to shake it off, tried to continue as if everything was normal. But normalcy was slipping through our fingers, like sand in an hourglass. That night, things got worse. We were sitting around a fire, trying to forget the terrifying figure we had seen, when the wind suddenly picked up. The air grew colder, and the trees began to sway. But something wasn't right. The wind didn't feel natural. It felt like it was moving around us, deliberately, as if it were trying to send a message. Then the fire flickered, casting strange shadows on the ground. The flames seemed to jump unnaturally, dancing wildly, even though there was no reason for it. I stood up to check the fire, but as I did, I felt a sudden coldness grip me. My breath caught in my throat. The wind stopped, leaving an eerie stillness behind. I turned to look at the others, but they had all stopped talking. Their faces were frozen, their eyes wide with fear. And then, it happened. From the darkness, we heard a soft, high-pitched laugh. It was faint at first, almost too quiet to hear. But as the seconds stretched on, it grew louder. It was unmistakable. It was human, but not. The laugh was distorted, like it had been stretched and twisted, warped into something malicious. Rob was the first to react. He jumped to his feet, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he shouted, looking around frantically. "There's no one here." I couldn't speak. I was frozen, my entire body trembling with fear. The laugh continued, growing louder, until it felt as though it was coming from every direction at once. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The air became deathly quiet again, and we were left standing there, staring at each other in shock. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel muttered, his voice shaking. "We need to leave," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But even as we packed our things and began to move toward the car, the feeling of being watched never left. It was like the forest itself was alive, breathing, watching our every move. That night, we left the campsite early, driven by a fear we couldn't explain. The forest had become something else, something that no longer felt like the peaceful place we had walked into days ago. It had become a place of fear, a place where things weren't quite right, where the air itself seemed to carry a warning. But even as we left, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something that wasn't ready to let us go. We weren't done yet. The drive back was tense and silent. We had barely spoken since we left the campsite, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the forest looming around us. But even as we put distance between ourselves and the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. It was Olivia who broke the silence first. "Why do I feel like we're still being watched?" Her words echoed my own thoughts exactly. The closer we got to civilization, the more I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing. Just the empty road behind. But the unease lingered. "We're out of the woods," Rob said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice was shaky. He was clearly trying to convince himself as much as us. "We're fine. It's over." Yet I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut that told me it wasn't over, not by a long shot. As we neared the town, we decided to stop at a small diner. It wasn't much, just a quiet, rustic place on the outskirts of town. But the moment we walked in, the strange atmosphere from the forest followed us inside. The walls felt too close, and the low hum of conversation seemed muffled, as though we were in a bubble, separated from the rest of the world. We sat in a booth, and for a while, the silence was broken only by the clinking of silverware and the occasional murmur from the other patrons. But even the normalcy of the diner couldn't shake the oppressive feeling that hung in the air. My mind kept replaying the events from earlier, the laugh, the figure in the trees, the overwhelming sense of dread. I tried to push it away, but it kept creeping back. The waitress, a woman in her late 40s, with tired eyes and a stiff smile, came over to take our order. But before any of us could say anything, she froze, her gaze locked on us, wide with shock. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You shouldn't have gone there." We all exchanged confused looks, but before any of us could respond, she quickly added, "It's not safe. Not anymore. No one who goes into those woods ever comes out the same." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I felt my blood run cold. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight. She shook her head, refusing to meet our eyes. "There's things out there. People don't talk about it, but you need to know. You should have left when you had the chance." She turned and walked away, leaving us in stunned silence. None of us knew what to say. There was no doubt in my mind now that something was very wrong with those woods. But it wasn't until later that night, when we finally returned to the hotel, that everything came crashing down. I was the last one to enter the room, and as I did, I felt it. That feeling again. The one I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the memories. It was something else, something in the room itself. I glanced around, trying to shake off the sense of unease. The others were sitting on their beds, staring at their phones or scrolling through messages, trying to distract themselves from the reality of the past few days. But it wasn't working. I could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken fear that gripped us all. Rob suddenly stood up, looking pale. "There's something wrong with the lights," he muttered. "They keep flickering." He was right. The lights above us had started to buzz, flickering in and out, like a broken bulb that couldn't decide whether it wanted to stay on. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My heart began to race. Without warning, the room went dark. We all jumped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. But then, in the pitch-black darkness, I heard the sound of a low, grating laugh. It wasn't from any of us. It came from the corner of the room, a low, haunting noise that sent chills crawling down my back. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Olivia gasped, her voice trembling. "Please, no, not again." And then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the lights flickered back on. But this time, it was different. The room was no longer the same. The air felt thick and charged, as though something had shifted. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the figure. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It wasn't a distant shape seen from the trees. It was solid, human-shaped, and it was staring directly at us with hollow, empty eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The others were frozen too, their faces pale, their bodies stiff with fear. It was as if time had stopped, and all that mattered was the presence of that thing in the corner. It wasn't just any figure. It was something ancient, something that belonged to the woods. Its skin was cracked, like bark, and its hands were long, twisted, and clawed. The air around it shimmered, as though reality itself was bending in its presence. Olivia was the first to break the silence. She screamed, a piercing, gut-wrenching sound that seemed to tear through the air. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, but the atmosphere in the room thickened, becoming heavier with each passing second. "Get out!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. He grabbed his things and bolted for the door, but as he reached for the handle, it slammed shut, as if an invisible force was holding it closed. He pulled harder, his face contorted with panic, but it wouldn't budge. The figure didn't move. It didn't have to. It was the room itself that had become its prison. The walls seemed to close in on us, the ceiling lowering, the floor buckling, until I felt like I was suffocating. And then, in a voice that sounded like the earth itself groaning, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words were like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. The room spun, the air pressed in on me, and my mind struggled to grasp what was happening. We weren't dealing with a ghost, or a spirit, or any normal entity. This was something older, something tied to the very fabric of the earth, something that had been waiting for us. I turned to the others, desperate for some sign of hope, but their faces were pale with terror. Olivia was shaking, Daniel's hands were clenched into fists, and Rob was staring at the floor, his mouth moving silently, as if trying to pray. We were trapped. The walls were closing in. There was no way out. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The figure vanished, leaving nothing but the smell of damp earth in the air, the weight of its presence still hanging over us. We didn't speak for a long time. None of us could. We were too shaken, too overwhelmed by what had just happened. But we knew one thing. The woods weren't done with us yet. The room was silent, except for the sound of our ragged breathing. None of us moved at first. We were all too shaken, too disoriented by what we had just witnessed. The figure, the voice, the oppressive atmosphere, it felt like the world had shifted around us, and we were still standing in the aftermath of something we couldn't comprehend. I looked around at the others. Olivia's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but there was something else there too, something that looked like desperation. Daniel's hands were shaking, and Rob was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as if to hold himself together. We all knew that none of us would be able to sleep tonight. Not after what we'd seen. "We need to leave," Olivia finally said, her voice cracking. "This place. It's not safe. None of this is real anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been trying to hold on to some sense of normalcy, to tell myself that we were just imagining things, that it was all a trick of our minds. But now, with the weight of the figure's words still hanging in the air, I couldn't deny it anymore. We had crossed the line we couldn't come back from. "We can't just run," I said, my voice hoarse. "We need to figure out what's going on. This thing in the woods, it's tied to something. Something bigger." But Rob shook his head. "What are we supposed to do, huh? Go back to the woods and ask it to leave us alone? We need to get out of here." Now, his words carried an urgency I couldn't ignore. Every part of me wanted to argue, wanted to find answers, but something deep inside told me that Rob was right. Whatever it was that we had uncovered in those woods, it wasn't something we could fix. We were out of our depth, and the only thing we could do now was run. I glanced around at the others. Olivia was nodding, her expression desperate. Daniel looked torn, but his fear had taken over. It was clear that none of us were ready to face whatever lay ahead. We packed up our things quickly, but the process felt mechanical, as if we were just going through the motions, trying to get away from the suffocating weight of the room. Every noise, the rustling of bags, the creaking of the floorboards sounded louder than it should have, and every time the lights flickered, we all jumped. Finally, we made it out of the room and into the hallway. But as we stepped into the dimly lit corridor, I felt the air around us grow colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could almost feel the presence from earlier, lurking just beyond our sight. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, reacting to us, and the closer we got to the exit, the heavier the air became. It was as though we were walking through a fog of unseen eyes, all staring at us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Every step felt like an echo, reverberating in my skull, reminding me that we weren't alone. We hadn't been alone for a long time. We reached the front doors, but they didn't open. Rob pulled at the handle, his muscles straining, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic crept into my chest. We were trapped. I looked to the others, but their faces were just as confused as mine. Daniel stepped forward, shaking the door with both hands. "What the hell? It was open earlier," he hissed. Then, as if responding to his anger, the lights in the hallway went out. For a split second, I couldn't see anything, just the pitch-black darkness and the sound of our collective breathing. A voice, low, raspy, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." It was the same voice we'd heard in the room, the same voice that had spoken to us in the woods. It sent a wave of ice through my veins, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. But it wasn't just the voice. It was the air around us, thick with something dark, something ancient. "Get out of here!" Olivia screamed, her voice raw. She pulled at the door again, and this time it opened with a sudden, violent shove. Without a word, we rushed outside. The cool night air hit us like a wave, but it didn't feel as freeing as it should have. The woods were still there, still just beyond the edge of the parking lot. We could still see the outline of the trees, as if they were watching us, waiting for us to return. The parking lot felt vast and empty, the only sound our footsteps on the cracked pavement. We didn't even bother to look back at the hotel as we ran to the car. We were just desperate to leave, to put as much distance between us and whatever haunted those woods. I glanced at the others as we piled into the car. Rob's face was pale, his hands tight on the wheel, while Daniel and Olivia sat in silence, staring straight ahead, as if trying to ignore the weight of what had just happened. It was as if we were all in shock, unable to process the nightmare that had unfolded around us. As we drove away, the trees seemed to close in around us, their dark silhouettes pressing against the edges of the headlights. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following us, that something was still watching us. The road stretched out ahead, but even as we passed familiar landmarks, I couldn't escape the feeling that we weren't free. Not yet. We didn't speak much on the drive back. The only sounds in the car were the hum of the engine and the occasional turn of the tires against the road. Every once in a while, I would glance at the others, but none of us knew what to say. What could we say? What had happened? What were we even running from? I don't know how long we drove. It felt like hours, but I couldn't tell. All I could think about was the figure, the voice, and the words that still haunted me. "You shouldn't have come." The car pulled into the small gas station, and we finally stopped. I felt a sense of relief, but it wasn't the same as before. We weren't safe. Not really. Not until we had answers. We stood around the car, each of us looking at the ground, unsure of what to say. And then Rob, the one who had been the most eager to leave, spoke up. "What the hell was that? What was in the woods?" he asked, his voice low. I couldn't answer him. I didn't have the words. I didn't even know where to start. All I knew was that something had followed us, and it wasn't done with us yet. We could leave the woods behind, But the forest had changed us. It had marked us. And I had a feeling we'd never truly be free from it. We never spoke about it again. Not to each other, not to anyone. It was like an unspoken rule that had been set in place the moment we left that place behind. There was a heavy silence that followed us, a lingering unease that none of us could shake off. But we couldn't explain it, none of us could. And maybe that was what made it worse. The months that followed were oddly quiet. We tried to go back to our normal lives, as though nothing had happened, as though we hadn't been through something that had fundamentally altered our perception of reality. But deep down, I knew that we had all been marked by that experience. We couldn't escape it, no matter how far we ran. Olivia moved to another town shortly after, leaving behind the life she had known. She never gave a clear reason, just said she needed a fresh start. But I could tell that she was trying to outrun something that had taken root in her mind and refused to let go. Daniel and Rob stayed close by, but things between us weren't the same. We weren't the group of friends we had been before. We had become strangers, bound by a shared trauma we couldn't talk about. I don't know what happened to the hotel. We tried to look it up after we got back, but there was nothing, no record of it, no history, nothing. It was as if it had never existed at all, and yet we all knew it had. The woods still stood, dark and silent in the distance, as if they were waiting for someone else to stumble across them. But as time passed, I began to wonder if that's exactly what it was waiting. Was the forest calling to us that night? Had it been watching, tracking our every move? I couldn't help but think back to the figure, to the voice, and to the warning we had been given. Maybe it wasn't just the hotel that was haunted. Maybe the entire forest had a history we couldn't comprehend, something ancient, something far beyond what we had imagined. Maybe we weren't the first to be drawn into its grip. I found myself returning to the woods in my thoughts over and over. At night, in the quiet moments when my mind had nothing else to do, the memories would flood back, clearer than ever. The flickering lights, the strange whispers, the eyes in the dark. And always, the voice. I think the hardest part of it all was the feeling of never truly knowing what happened. What had we experienced? What had we seen? What had followed us? Every time I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation, every time I tried to convince myself that it was just some twisted hallucination, the memories came crashing back, relentless and unforgiving. There was a constant feeling of being watched, even in the safety of my own home. It's the kind of thing that gnaws at you slowly, until one day you wake up and realize that you haven't felt truly safe in months. And it wasn't just me. I heard from Rob not long ago. He said he'd been having strange dreams where he was standing at the edge of the woods, feeling the pull of something he couldn't see but knew was there. He said the trees called to him. He was starting to think it wasn't just a dream. And then there was Olivia. She came back into town unexpectedly about 6 months after she moved away. She didn't stay long, just enough to pick up a few things and disappear again. But when I ran into her, I saw something in her eyes that unsettled me. She was looking at me as if she knew I knew what had happened, as if she too had been keeping it all inside. When I asked her if she'd found peace after leaving, she didn't answer right away. She just stared at me for a long time, and then she said, "It's still out there, you know, waiting. It never really ends." I didn't ask her to elaborate. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what she meant. That conversation stuck with me. The way her words lingered in the air like a warning that was meant for me. It wasn't over. It never had been. And as for me, well, I don't think I'll ever forget what we went through that night in the woods. I don't think I'll ever truly feel safe again. I've learned that some things are better left unexplored, some places better left undisturbed. But the truth is, I still think about the woods, still feel its pull. Sometimes, when the night is still and the world is quiet, I catch myself wondering if I'll ever go back there again. I don't know why I think that way. Maybe it's the curiosity, the need for closure, or maybe it's because a part of me still feels like I owe it to myself to understand what happened. But something inside tells me that going back is a bad idea. Some things, once encountered, can never be fully understood. Some things will always remain a mystery. It's strange, the way a place can stick with you. A place from your childhood that you think you've forgotten. only to have it sneak up on you years later when you least expect it. I grew up in a small town, one of those places that never seems to change, where everyone knows each other, and there's a certain kind of comfort in the familiarity of it all. It was the kind of town where everyone had their routine, their little haunts. And for me, one of those haunts was the park. The park was the heart of the neighborhood, a gathering place for kids during summer break, a spot for quiet walks in the late afternoon, and a safe haven for families on weekends. My friends and I used to spend hours there, running around, playing games, or just sitting under the shade of the big oak trees. The swings would creak in the wind, and the smell of freshly mown grass would linger in the air. It was simple, but it was home. Nothing could go wrong at the park. It was where we found joy, freedom, and peace. But one day, it all changed. We grew older, and naturally, the park became less important. We moved on to other interests, other places. The park faded into the background of our memories, just another landmark of our childhood, forgotten and left behind. At least, that's what I thought until one day, years later, I drove past the park again. I had been away for a while, living in the city, chasing my career, and trying to figure out who I was in the hustle and bustle of it all. But something called me back to that little town, something I couldn't shake. It had been over a decade since I'd set foot in the park, and in my mind, it was still that same old, familiar place. But as I turned onto the street that led to it, something felt off. I pulled into the old parking lot, which had been empty when I used to visit. Now, the faded lines were barely visible, and the lot felt too quiet, too still. I parked my car and got out, the cool breeze carrying the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. It felt wrong, but at the same time, it felt like nothing had changed. I hadn't come back to the park in years, but it was as if a part of me had never left. Walking towards the entrance, I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling in my stomach. The entrance gate was rusty now, its once bright red paint chipped and peeling. The large sign that used to proudly display the park's name had been taken down, leaving only the bare metal frame behind. I walked past the stone benches that had always been in the same places, but now they were covered in layers of moss, as if time had moved on without them. The swings that used to fly through the air with the laughter of children now hung motionless. They were old, sure, but they looked abandoned, untouched. As I ventured further into the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the physical decay I was witnessing, it was the silence. There were no kids playing, no families having picnics, no sounds of life. It was as if the entire park had been frozen in time, waiting for something. But what? I wandered deeper, trying to convince myself that it was just the passage of time, that I was overreacting. After all, it had been years since anyone had cared for the park. It was old, forgotten, left to wither away. That was all. But the feeling gnawed at me, and as I looked around, the remnants of my childhood began to feel more like a distant memory than a reality. The park was deserted, yes, but there was more to it than that. Something was missing. Something wasn't right. I paused for a moment, standing by the old playground equipment, now covered in rust and overgrown with weeds. It was the same, and yet it wasn't. And as I stood there, something deep inside me began to stir. A memory from the past, a feeling from long ago, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I turned around, ready to leave, but before I could take a single step, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint, barely perceptible over the wind, but it was there, a rustling sound, like something shifting in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. Was someone else here? I looked around quickly, my eyes scanning the park, but there was no sign of anyone. It was just me. I took a breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and reminded myself that it was just my imagination. It had to be, but still, that sound lingered in my mind. That unsettling, almost imperceptible rustle. And as I walked back toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Little did I know, I was just beginning to scratch the surface of what had happened to this once vibrant place, and what lay ahead would be something I would never forget. The first sign that something wasn't quite right didn't come all at once. It wasn't some dramatic, spine-chilling event that made me jump out of my skin. It was more like a feeling, a subtle, creeping discomfort that seemed to grow the longer I stayed in the park. I had convinced myself that I was simply overthinking things. After all, it had been a long time since I had been there. Maybe I had just forgotten how things had changed. Maybe it was just the emptiness that felt strange, nothing more. But then, I heard it again. That rustling noise. I had stopped walking when I first heard it. I had been lost in thought, looking around the place that had once held so many memories for me. It was as if I had stepped into a time capsule, and I was waiting for something to shake it loose. That rustling, soft yet distinct, came from the other side of the playground. This time, I wasn't sure it was my imagination. The air seemed to thicken, as if the park itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I looked around quickly, half expecting to see someone, maybe another lost soul, wandering through the overgrown paths like me. But there was nothing. No one. "Hello?" I called out, my voice carrying across the deserted park. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway in response, but there was no answer. I stood there for a moment, my eyes scanning the area, my heart thumping louder with each passing second. Just as I was about to shake it off and turn to leave, I heard the rustling again, but this time it was closer. I froze. This wasn't a sound I recognized, certainly not something that should be happening in an abandoned park. It was almost like something or someone was moving through the tall grass, just out of sight. I took a few steps forward, my boots crunching on the gravel path beneath me. The sound stopped abruptly, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. But then, I saw a figure. It wasn't clear at first. It wasn't a person, exactly, but more like a shadow, shifting at the edge of the trees. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, trying to adjust to the dimming light of the late afternoon. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. My stomach twisted into a knot. There was no mistaking it. Something was wrong. But what could it be? I stood still, waiting, listening for any further sounds. The park remained silent, the wind rustling through the trees as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I couldn't explain it. Everything about the place seemed off, like the world had forgotten it existed. It was then that I noticed something else. The benches that used to line the paths, the same benches where we'd spend hours sitting and talking as kids, were all tipped over, broken, or covered in thick layers of moss. This was new. This was different. The park hadn't been in perfect shape when I left, but it had never been in this state of disrepair. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure that this was just the result of time. This felt like neglect, intentional neglect. I took another step forward, my eyes scanning the area, trying to make sense of everything. It wasn't just the physical state of the park that bothered me. It was the strange stillness in the air, the way everything felt wrong. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than a product of my overactive mind, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. I walked toward the far corner of the park, where the old basketball court used to be. It had always been a lively spot, with kids shooting hoops and laughing in the afternoons. But now, the court was abandoned. The hoops were bent and broken, the paint on the ground faded and cracked. And there, in the center of the court, something caught my eye. A piece of paper fluttering in the breeze. It looked like a map, or perhaps a drawing, but it was hard to tell from this distance. I approached cautiously, my every step echoing in the stillness. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't a map at all, but rather something far more unsettling. The paper was old, torn at the edges, and stained with what looked like dark, dried ink. In the center of the paper, written in shaky, uneven handwriting, were the words, "Leave now." I picked it up, my hands trembling. Who had left this here, and why? The handwriting didn't look like anything I recognized. It didn't belong to any of my childhood friends, nor did it belong to anyone I knew from the town. As I stared at the words, a chill ran down my spine. The air grew heavier, the wind picking up in sudden gusts, rustling the leaves and making the trees creak. I turned around quickly, as if expecting to find someone standing just behind me, watching me. But there was no one. I felt a strange pull to leave, to get out of the park and go back to my car. But something kept me there, tethered to that spot. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something I couldn't see yet, but something that was waiting. I shoved the paper into my jacket pocket, wanting to get away from that eerie message. But before I could take a step, I heard it again, the rustling sound, louder this time, as if something was moving closer to me. I turned around, heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The shadows stretched longer now, the sun having nearly dipped below the horizon, but there was no one there. The park remained empty, silent, abandoned. I slowly made my way back toward the exit, my eyes darting around the park, searching for any sign of movement. My footsteps felt too loud, too heavy against the silence. I was aware of every little noise, the crunch of the gravel beneath my feet, the creaking of the trees, the wind howling as it picked up speed. I reached the gate, my pulse still racing, my hands clammy with sweat. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice whisper, just faint enough to make me question whether I had really heard it at all. "Stay. You'll see." I spun around, eyes wide with terror. But there was nothing, just the empty park, standing as it always had. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into something I wasn't meant to understand, something dark that had seeped into every corner of the abandoned park. The once familiar sights now felt foreign, unsettling. The rustling that had once been nothing more than an occasional sound now seemed to follow me. Every turn I took, every path I walked, I could hear it quiet, but persistent, like something was skirting just behind my peripheral vision, just beyond the reach of my sight. It didn't help that the sun had disappeared completely now, leaving behind only the soft, fading light of dusk. The park, once a lively place, had transformed. The familiar landmarks that used to bring me comfort, the swings, the old wooden gazebo, the wide field where we used to play now, all looked warped and decayed, as though years had been condensed into mere moments. The first night I came back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was strange, but not in the way you'd expect. There were no faces peering out from behind trees, no shadows lurking in the corners. Instead, it felt like the park itself was alive, observing me, waiting for something. The air hung heavy with an almost suffocating stillness. The sounds of the world outside the parked cars, the occasional dog barking, seemed muffled, as if some invisible barrier had been erected between me and the rest of the world. I spent the next few days returning, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I needed to understand what was going on. Why did I feel like I was being pulled back to this forsaken place? I couldn't just leave. Not now. The second time I visited, the park seemed even quieter than before. The absence of people was not just noticeable, it was unnatural. The swings, which I remembered being in near constant motion when I was young, hung limply, swaying only slightly in the breeze. The playground equipment, once colorful and vibrant, now sat in rusted silence, the paint chipped and peeling. There was no wind, yet the leaves fluttered across the cracked asphalt path, as though some unseen force was gently sweeping them along. It wasn't until I approached the old gazebo that I noticed something different. It wasn't the broken slats of wood or the overgrown ivy creeping up the sides. It was the smell. At first, I thought it was just the decay of the place, damp earth, mildew, the musty scent of forgotten years. But then I realized something else. It was a pungent odor, sharp and metallic, almost like blood. I stopped in my tracks, instinctively recoiling. The smell was faint, but it was there, and it wasn't the kind of scent you could ignore. I looked around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one else. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breath, coming faster and heavier with each passing second. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The park felt like it had grown in some way. The once familiar paths now seemed to twist and bend, leading me deeper into the unknown corners of the space. There was something unnerving about it. The trees looked older, their trunks wider and gnarled, as if they were centuries old rather than just a few decades. The playground equipment, rusted and broken, appeared even more neglected. I pushed forward, walking past the gazebo and toward the far end of the park where the old stone fountain stood. Once a place of laughter and play, it now appeared to be a silent monument to a forgotten past. The water, which should have been flowing freely, had stopped long ago, leaving the basin to collect nothing but the stagnant remnants of a once peaceful feature. As I approached, something caught my eye. A figure. It wasn't a person. It was something else in outline, a shape standing near the fountain. The wind had picked up again, making the trees creak and sway, but I could hear nothing else. No birds, no insects, no distant sounds of life. Just that eerie silence. I walked closer, my legs feeling heavier with each step. And then, just as I was about to call out, the figure disappeared. One moment it was there, standing motionless by the fountain, and the next it was gone, as if it had never been. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short bursts. Had I really seen that? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? The answer came in the form of another noise. A soft scraping sound, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the gravel path. I whipped around, expecting to see someone or something in my immediate vicinity. But once again, the park remained empty. I couldn't leave. I didn't know why, but something inside me urged me to stay. Maybe I could find answers. Maybe I could understand what was happening. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that answers weren't what I would find here. No, what was waiting for me in this cursed place was something far worse. The days blurred together, and with each visit, the occurrences grew more frequent, more intense. I started to hear voices. Faint, distant whispers that seemed to come from the trees, from the shadows themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, desperate. One afternoon, I decided to take a different path, one that led me behind the old playground and toward the forest that bordered the park. The trees were dense there, the underbrush thick with overgrowth. It was quiet, unnervingly so. The usual sounds of nature birds, rustling leaves were absent. I walked deeper into the forest, the ground beneath my feet soft and damp from the recent rain. But then, I stopped. Something caught my eye. A figure standing motionless near a large oak tree. It was cloaked in shadow, but I could see the outline clearly now. A person. But who? I stepped closer, calling out, "Hey, are you lost?" No answer. I was almost within reach when the figure turned sharply, vanishing into the dense thicket before I could get any closer. "Wait," I called, my voice cracking slightly, but it was no use. The figure was gone. That was when I started to feel the weight of this place. The park wasn't just abandoned, it was hiding something. Something, or someone. And it wasn't something I could just walk away from. It was then that I noticed the marked scratches on the bark of the trees, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. They seemed fresh, still oozing something dark and sticky. I ran my fingers over one of the scars, feeling a strange, almost electric tingle under my skin. The sensation made my hair stand on end, and I quickly pulled my hand away. I couldn't shake the feeling that the park was more than just a collection of old, decaying structures. It was alive. It had been waiting for something or someone. I couldn't leave. I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I found out what was really going on. By the time I returned to the park that night, the tension in the air was suffocating. My every step was weighed down by the looming sense of dread that followed me wherever I went. It was as though the park had become a living thing, breathing, pulsating with an energy I couldn't understand. The trees towered above me like ancient sentinels, and the moon, full and cold, hung high in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with a life of their own. I had been coming here every night, driven by an overwhelming compulsion to uncover the truth. Every time I thought I might be close to understanding what was happening, something new would reveal itself, something darker, something far more sinister than I was prepared for. I had heard the whispers more clearly now, and though I still couldn't make out the words, I knew they were calling to me. The more I listened, the more I could feel them pulling me deeper into the heart of the park, deeper into whatever darkness it was hiding. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, I felt a sense of finality, as if everything had led me to this exact moment. There was no turning back. I walked down the familiar path toward the old fountain. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the usual sounds of the outside world completely absent. No cars, no distant voices, no dogs barking in the distance. Just the quiet creak of the trees and the sound of my own footsteps on the cracked, uneven pavement. As I approached the fountain, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a figure, standing motionless at the base of the stone structure. I froze. It wasn't a person, not really. Not in the sense I had come to understand. It was more of a shape, an outline, darker than the surrounding shadows, almost as if it was absorbing the very light around it. The figure stood tall, unmoving, its form impossible to make out completely. Its edges seemed to blur, to waver, like smoke caught in a gust of wind. I wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to turn and leave, but my legs felt rooted to the ground, unwilling to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. I couldn't move. I was trapped, caught in the same hypnotic pull that had brought me here in the first place. The figure shifted, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a wave of cold through my body. It raised one hand, fingers outstretched, as though beckoning me. And then, in a voice that was more felt than heard, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The words echoed in my mind, not spoken aloud, but felt in the very core of my being. The voice was not human, not in any way I could describe. It was deeper than sound, more like a vibration that resonated inside my skull, vibrating my teeth and rattling my bones. It was a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, ancient and malevolent, and it sent a wave of terror crashing over me. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my throat dry and constricted. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, but I couldn't move. I couldn't run. I was rooted in place, as though some unseen force had trapped me in its grip. The figure did not respond. Instead, it stepped forward, its movement fluid and unnatural, like a shadow sliding across the ground. It came closer, and the air grew colder with each passing second. The once comforting chill of the night now felt like the touch of something dead, something long forgotten. I could feel the temperature plummeting, the warmth of my breath turning to mist before me. I reached out instinctively, my hand trembling as I tried to make sense of the shape in front of me. My fingers brushed against something cold, something unnatural, and I pulled my hand back in shock. The surface was smooth, but it was unlike anything I had ever touched. It was as though I was pressing my palm against stone, only to have it give way to something far more insidious beneath. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, and then without warning it vanished. One moment it was there, looming over me, and the next it was gone, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread in its wake. I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. What had just happened? What had I seen? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just come face to face with something that had been waiting for me all along. Something ancient. Something that had been hidden beneath the surface of the park, beneath the very earth itself, for who knows how long. My mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. I wanted to run, to escape the park and never look back, but something held me there. A compulsion, a force I couldn't explain, urging me to stay, to confront whatever it was that lived here. And then the whispers returned. Louder now, clearer, more insistent. They surrounded me, coming from every direction. They were no longer distant or muffled, but right there, pressing in on me. It was as though the park itself was alive, breathing in unison with me, filling the air with the suffocating weight of its presence. "You should have left." The voice echoed again, the words rattling in my chest. "Now you'll never leave." I turned around, my eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, any clue as to where the voice was coming from. But there was nothing. Just shadows. The same shadows that had always been there. But now they felt different. Now they felt like they were watching me, waiting. I took a step forward, then another, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I was lost in my thoughts, my senses overwhelmed by everything I had just witnessed, when I heard something, a scraping sound, sharp and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. It came from behind me, and I spun around, heart in my throat. There, in the darkness, was something else. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, I could make out the form of a person, or what looked like a person. But it wasn't right. It was twisted, distorted, its body unnaturally bent and contorted, as though it had been twisted and reshaped in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I could hear the sound of its breathing, shallow and uneven, like something trying to draw air into lungs that were not meant to work. The thing stood perfectly still, its head tilted to the side, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. And then it spoke. "Why didn't you leave?" It rasped, its voice ragged, almost choking on the words. "You can't leave. You can never leave." The fear that flooded through me was suffocating. I could feel my legs shaking beneath me, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't. I was trapped, stuck in this nightmarish place where reality and terror blurred into one. The thing began to move then, its steps jerky and disjointed, as if it wasn't used to walking. I could hear the crunch of its limbs against the gravel, the wet, squelching sound of its feet dragging across the ground. It moved toward me, and with each step it took, the air seemed to grow colder, denser. The shadows deepened, swallowing everything in their path. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead, my body unwilling to obey. And as the thing closed the distance between us, I felt it a cold, clammy hand wrapping around my wrist, pulling me back, pulling me toward it. In that moment, I realized that I had made a grave mistake. I should have left when I had the chance. I should have never come back. Because now, the park was claiming me. It was dragging me down into its darkness, into its endless void. The grip on my wrist tightened, pulling me further into the shadowed depths of the park. My mind raced, scrambling for a way out, for any escape from the nightmare that had become my reality. I couldn't breathe. The coldness seeped into my bones, my muscles freezing, my body immobilized by the overwhelming terror that surged through me. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, deafening in the silence that enveloped the park. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. The presence that had been haunting me, the twisted, contorted figure now inches away from me, seemed to be draining the strength from me, as if the very air around us was made of something darker, something that consumed all light and life. "You're not leaving," the creature rasped again, its voice barely audible, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it vibrated deep within me, rattling my bones. The grip on my wrist was impossibly cold, sending shocks of ice through my veins, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest, as though the entire park was closing in on me, suffocating me. I tried to pull my arm away, to free myself from its grasp, but my limbs felt heavy, as though they had been encased in concrete. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. It was as though the darkness itself had paralyzed me, wrapped me in its cold embrace, and I was powerless to escape. Then, just as the last threads of my consciousness seemed ready to snap, something shifted. The grip on my wrist loosened for a split second, just enough for me to break free. With every ounce of strength I had left, I wrenched my arm out of its grasp and staggered back, my breath ragged, my legs barely holding me up. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran through the park, the familiar path now foreign and hostile. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching, twisting as if alive, reaching out to grab me. The sound of my own breathing was loud in my ears, but every other sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of the branches, was drowned out by the pounding of my heart. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to escape. I needed to get out of that cursed place. The world around me blurred. I could barely keep my footing, the gravel path slipping beneath my shoes, the air growing colder, thicker with each step. The whispers had returned, louder now, echoing in my mind, but I couldn't make out the words anymore. They were no longer voices, but sensations, like fingers brushing against my skin, like the press of a hand on the back of my neck, pushing me forward, urging me onward, deeper into the park. But then, just as I thought I couldn't go on any longer, as my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out beneath me, I saw it. The exit. The gates, looming in the distance, bathed in the pale light of the moon. It was the only thing that seemed real in the chaos, the only thing that hadn't twisted and warped into something sinister. I pushed myself harder, faster, desperate to reach it. The whispers were growing louder, the shadows lengthening behind me, but I didn't dare stop. Not now. Not when I was so close. And then, finally, I reached the gates. The iron bars were cold beneath my trembling hands as I pushed them open, stumbling into the street beyond. For a moment, I just stood there, gasping for air, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on me. The park was silent now. The gate swung gently in the wind, and the shadows that had once seemed to follow me now stood still, watching, waiting, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I don't know how long I stood there, the world spinning around me, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. The fear, the terror, the unknown. The park had become a prison, a place where nothing made sense, where time had no meaning, where the rules of the world I once knew no longer applied. But now I was free, or so I thought. The road was empty, and the night seemed to breathe around me, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I looked around, half expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was desolate. No lights in the windows, no cars driving by. It was like I had stepped into another world, one that was just as empty as the park I had just fled from. I could hear the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven, as I tried to process everything that had happened. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but the answers eluded me. What was that thing in the park? Why had it been waiting for me? Was I the only one who had ever noticed? Had anyone else come to the park to experience what I had? I had so many questions, but no answers. It was as if the entire event had been an illusion, a terrible dream that I had somehow woken up from. But the fear, the coldness, the feeling of being hunted, it all felt too real to be a mere figment of my imagination. I started walking, my legs unsteady beneath me, the weight of my experience still heavy on my shoulders. I couldn't shake the feeling that the park was still there, just beyond the edge of my vision, still watching, still waiting for me to return. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't even think about going back. Not after everything that had happened. As I walked further down the street, I noticed something strange. The houses, the buildings, everything seemed out of place. They were too quiet, too still. It was as though the entire world had fallen asleep, and I was the only one still awake, still trapped in the aftermath of what had happened. And then a chill ran down my spine. I stopped dead in my tracks, a wave of nausea washing over me. It was the whisper again. But this time, it wasn't in my mind. It was in the air around me, like a distant murmur just out of reach. "You shouldn't have left," it said, so quietly that I almost didn't hear it. I froze. I turned, but the street behind me was empty. No one was there. There was no one in sight. Yet I could feel it. The presence. The same feeling that had gripped me in the park, that had paralyzed me with fear, was now following me again, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of my awareness. I started to run again, faster now, not caring where I was going. My footsteps echoed in the empty street, the sound of my panic louder than anything else. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the park was still out there, waiting for me. I had left, but it hadn't let me go. The question now wasn't whether I could escape. It was whether I ever would. The night air felt heavier as I ran, my footsteps pounding against the pavement, my chest tight with fear. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, every movement in the corner of my eye sending a jolt of panic through my veins. I didn't know where I was going anymore, only that I had to keep moving. I had to get as far away from that park as possible. But no matter how far I ran, it felt like something was still with me, lurking just behind my every step, like a shadow I couldn't escape. My mind kept replaying the moments in the park, the whispers, the cold touch, the terrifying presence that had surrounded me, the grip on my wrist, the twisted figure, the feeling that I wasn't alone. It all felt too real, too close, as if the park had somehow followed me, left a part of itself in the world beyond the gates. I wasn't sure how much time passed. Hours? Minutes? The world around me was a blur, and my mind was clouded with a rush of adrenaline. The quiet streets seemed endless, the darkened houses standing like silent witnesses to my flight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something out there, something that had followed me. I stumbled into a small alley, the walls narrowing around me, the dim light from a street lamp casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. I slowed my pace, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I couldn't keep running. My legs were giving out, my muscles aching, and the weight of everything that had happened was starting to sink in. I turned a corner and nearly collided with a figure standing in the shadows. My heart stopped. It was the man, the one I had seen earlier in the park, the one who had been watching me, the one who had seemed to know something about the darkness that had taken over the place. His face was pale, almost sickly, his eyes hollow and dark, like two empty voids. He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. "You shouldn't have left," he whispered, his voice low and calm, like he was speaking to someone who had already made a terrible mistake. I backed away, panic rising in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I gasped, my voice barely audible, as though I couldn't breathe. His lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's already been set in motion. You can't undo it. You can't run from it. It's already inside you now." My mind spun, and I had to force myself to focus, to make sense of the words. "What are you talking about? What's inside me?" The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "The park doesn't let go. Once you felt it, once you've been marked, there's no escaping it. It'll always find you. Always." I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart hammering in my chest. I took another step back, but my legs felt unsteady, like they were sinking into the ground. The weight of his words settled over me like a blanket of dread, smothering every thought, every hope of escape. "No, no, this can't be real," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head, trying to convince myself that this was just some twisted nightmare, that none of this had happened. But the man's expression didn't change. He just stood there, watching me, his presence somehow more oppressive than the shadows around us. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was being sucked into the darkness that seemed to pulse from him. "You already know it's real," he said softly, almost kindly. "That park isn't just a place. It's a memory, a part of something bigger than you can comprehend. And now that it's touched you, it'll never let go. It's a part of you. It's always been." I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. My mind screamed for clarity, for escape, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the weight of the truth I had just been given. The park. That damn park. It wasn't just an abandoned place. It wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a living thing, something that fed off fear, off the lives of those who entered it. And somehow I had been drawn to it, chosen by it, marked by it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to ask him why. Why me? Why this had to happen? But the words stuck in my throat. My body trembled, and I realized, with a sickening clarity, that it wasn't just my mind that was reacting to this. It was my very soul, my existence, being torn apart by the revelation that there was no way out. The man's smile faded, and his eyes darkened, almost pitying. "It's too late for you," he said simply. "But you'll learn. You'll learn what it means to be chosen by the park." Then, as if the world itself had shifted, the man was gone. In the blink of an eye, he was nothing more than a shadow, melting into the night. I stood there, staring into the empty space where he had been, the silence ringing in my ears. My heart continued to pound, my mind racing, but I couldn't make sense of anything anymore. The park, the creature, the man in the shadows, it was all connected, all part of something far greater, far darker than I could ever understand. And as I stood there in the alley, my mind trying to grasp the enormity of what I had just learned, I realized that the park hadn't truly let me go. It had never intended to. The man had been right. Once you were touched by it, once you had stepped into its realm, you could never escape. It would follow you, haunt you until the end of your days. I looked around, my heart racing. The streets were empty. The shadows stretched as if they were waiting for me to make a move. But there was no safe place anymore. No sanctuary. The park wasn't just a location. It was something that lived within me now. And wherever I went, it would follow, creeping in the corners of my mind, twisting the world around me until I could no longer tell what was real and what was part of the nightmare. With a final, heavy breath, I stepped out of the alley and into the night. There was no turning back now. And as I walked into the darkness, I knew one thing for certain. The park would always be there, lurking in the shadows, just beyond my reach. It was a crisp autumn evening when I first arrived at the old hotel. The wind had started picking up, rustling the leaves that had fallen in a thick blanket over the cobblestone streets. I had been on the road for hours, and the weariness of travel was starting to catch up with me. I didn't want to drive another mile. I needed rest, and when I spotted the grand building from a distance, I knew it was the perfect place to settle in for the night. The hotel stood at the end of a narrow, winding road that seemed almost forgotten by time. It was a majestic structure, built in the early 1900s, with large, sweeping windows, intricate stonework, and an old-fashioned sign that hung slightly crooked above the entrance. The type of place you'd imagine being featured in a period drama, with an air of elegance and mystery. You could tell by its faded beauty that it had a history, one that most people probably didn't know or had forgotten. When I walked into the lobby, a sense of quiet enveloped me. The place had a charm, but it was also oddly cold, despite the crackling fireplace nearby. I was greeted by an elderly man behind the reception desk. His name was Henry, a man whose face seemed to be carved from stone, his white hair neatly combed, and his posture ramrod straight. There was something about him, maybe it was the way his eyes darted nervously to the side whenever he spoke, that made me feel uneasy. But I chalked it up to the fact that it had been a long day, and I was just tired. "Welcome to the Wyndham Hotel, sir," Henry said, his voice low and gravelly. "I trust you're looking for a room for the night?" I nodded, telling him I was just passing through and needed somewhere to rest. He handed me the key to room 217. It was an older, ornate key, the kind that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a modern hotel. As he passed it to me, his fingers brushed mine, and I noticed that his hands were cold, unnaturally cold. "Right this way," Henry said, gesturing toward the stairs. "Up the second flight. Your room will be at the end of the hall." I didn't think much of it at first, but something about his tone seemed off, like he was urging me to hurry without actually saying the words. I thanked him and made my way upstairs. The hallway on the second floor was dimly lit, with wallpaper that had seen better days. The faint smell of dust lingered in the air, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. At the end of the hall, I found my room. Room 217. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was charming, though aged. A large four-poster bed stood in the center, covered in an old quilt, and the furniture was antique dark wood, polished to a shine. There was a fireplace in the corner, its mantel decorated with a few knickknacks. The window offered a view of the parking lot and the dark, empty road stretching out beyond. I threw my bag on the bed and sank into the armchair by the window, gazing out into the night. The silence of the place was almost deafening, and I could feel a weight pressing down on me. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I decided to take a long, hot shower to shake off the weariness of the road. As the water ran over me, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was in the bathroom, too. There were no sounds from the hallway, no distant murmurs of voices, or the usual hustle and bustle of a busy hotel, just silence. When I finished, I dressed in my pajamas and made my way back into the room. The fire had gone out, and the room was starting to feel colder than it should have been. I pulled the quilt tighter around me, but it didn't seem to help much. The chill in the air felt off, almost as if it were coming from within the walls themselves. There was a knock at the door. I stood up, startled. Who could it be at this hour? I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door a crack. Standing in the hallway was a woman pale, wearing a long, dark coat. Her hair was dark and tangled, falling messily around her face. Her eyes, though, were what caught me off guard. They were wide, almost too wide, as if she hadn't slept in days. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "Have you seen him?" I frowned, unsure of how to respond. "Seen who?" I asked. "The man who's been following me," she said, her voice trembling now. "He's here. I can feel him." Before I could ask any more questions, she turned and walked quickly down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. What kind of person would come to a hotel, clearly distressed, and then simply vanish without a word? I locked the door and turned the lights off, trying to shake off the strange encounter. but something told me that I wasn't going to be getting any sleep that night. Something was off about this place. Something that had nothing to do with the eerie silence or the cold air. And deep down, I knew I wasn't going to be alone for long. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the old clock in the corner of the room ticking away, its rhythmic ticking almost too loud in the quiet stillness. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the weight of the night still hanging over me. Despite the strange woman's unsettling appearance and the eerie sense that something wasn't quite right, I had managed to fall asleep for a few hours. But the light from the rising sun did little to calm the unease that gnawed at me. I got dressed and made my way downstairs for breakfast. The dining room was located just off the lobby, and it felt even more outdated in the daylight. The heavy curtains were drawn open, revealing a dreary sky outside, and a lone chandelier hung above the tables, casting a dim glow on the otherwise cold, clinical atmosphere. There was a small buffet with muffins, eggs, and coffee, but it didn't look particularly inviting. I took a seat near the window and scanned the room. The same elderly man, Henry, was behind the counter again. He gave me a tight-lipped smile as I poured myself a cup of coffee. His eyes flicked to the side briefly, almost as if he were trying to avoid looking directly at me. I could feel the tension in the air, as though something was about to happen, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. I was about to take a sip of my coffee when I noticed something odd in the reflection of the window across from me. At first, it was subtle, a faint, dark shape, like a shadow moving against the glass. My mind immediately jumped to conclusions, thinking maybe it was just the reflection of a car or someone walking outside. But the longer I stared, the more distinct the shape became, and it was moving closer. I tried to focus on the outside world through the window, but there was no one there. The parking lot was empty, save for a few scattered leaves tumbling across the pavement. The shape in the window was still there, though something I couldn't explain. My heart rate quickened, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Suddenly, the reflection shifted, as though someone had just walked behind me. I jerked my head around, my pulse racing. No one was there. The dining room was empty, save for Henry behind the counter, who didn't seem to notice anything. He continued to go about his business, wiping down the same spot on the counter repeatedly, his eyes fixed on some distant point. I quickly stood up and walked toward the door. I needed to get some air to clear my head. Something was more off than I'd initially thought. As I stepped out into the fresh air, the cold breeze greeted me with a sharp chill. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart, and glanced around at the isolated hotel. Everything seemed normal again, too normal. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something strange. The door to room 217, the one I'd stayed in, was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. In fact, I had been so careful to make sure the door was locked when I left, especially after the strange incident with the woman. A small part of me told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door and pushed it open, stepping inside. The room looked undisturbed at first glance, but as I walked further in, I noticed something odd on the bed, a thin layer of dust, where none had been before. The quilt, which I had left neatly folded, was now askew, as though someone had been lying there. My chest tightened. Had someone been in the room? The thought unsettled me, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe housekeeping had come in, or perhaps I had simply forgotten how the bed had been arranged the night before. But there was something else. The fireplace, which had been cold when I left, was now faintly glowing, as though someone had recently stoked the fire. The flames were small, barely noticeable, but they shouldn't have been there. I didn't remember anyone coming in while I was gone, and there was no sign of anyone in the room. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't possible no one had entered the room. I had locked the door myself. I quickly backed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My mind was racing with questions. What was going on? Who had been in my room? I didn't see anyone when I stepped out into the hallway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back downstairs to confront Henry, but he wasn't at the desk. The lobby was eerily quiet, and I stood there for a few moments, debating what to do. My nerves were frayed, and I could feel the weight of the building pressing down on me. It was as though the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Just then, Henry appeared from behind a door I hadn't noticed before, his eyes darting around as if he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. He gave me a tight smile as I approached the desk. "Is everything to your liking, sir?" he asked, his voice smooth and calculated. I hesitated, then spoke, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. I noticed that my room door was open when I got back, and the bed it was disturbed. Henry's eyes flickered for a moment before he quickly regained his composure. "Ah, yes, that must have been housekeeping. They must have been in while you were out. Apologies for any confusion." I didn't believe him, but I nodded, not wanting to press the issue further. Something told me that Henry was more than just a hotel clerk. He was a part of something bigger, something I couldn't quite understand. As I turned to leave, I heard him mutter under his breath. "They always come back," he said, too quietly for me to hear the full sentence. I froze in place, my blood running cold. Who was he talking about? I didn't dare turn around, not wanting to confirm that the words had come from him. Instead, I quickly left the lobby and went back to my room, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sense of unease grew stronger with each passing minute until it felt suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch further, and I could swear I heard someone moving in the hallway just outside my door. But when I looked through the peephole, there was nothing there. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take me. But no matter how tired I was, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting for me. The clock on the wall ticked away the hours, but all I could do was lie there, wide awake, hoping that the morning light would bring with it some kind of answer. The days that followed were a blur of unease and growing suspicion. Every corner of the hotel seemed to hide something. Every shadow cast a longer, more foreboding presence. The once charming, albeit old-fashioned atmosphere of the hotel had turned unsettling, like an old photograph that had slowly begun to fade and warp, distorting the memories of what was once normal. I couldn't ignore the growing sense of being watched, the almost tangible feeling that something was not right. Every small sound, every creak of the building seemed amplified in the silence that hung in the air. It wasn't just the oddity of room 217 or the strange encounter with Henry. It was everything. The hotel itself, the hallways, the rooms. It was as if the walls were closing in on me, each step I took pulling me deeper into something I couldn't comprehend. One evening, I decided to confront my suspicions head-on. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more going on than just strange occurrences. I needed to know what was behind it all. Maybe it was the old history of the hotel, or maybe it was the unsettling behavior of the staff, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to investigate. I started by poking around the hotel's library, which, like the rest of the hotel, was draped in an air of age and neglect. The musty smell of old books filled my nostrils as I walked between the rows of yellowed pages. I ran my fingers across the spines, looking for any clue, any scrap of information that could explain what was happening. The library felt as though it was stuck in a time long past, like a forgotten chapter of the hotel's history that had never been told. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, some mention of the hotel's past, perhaps, but as I flipped through the books, I found nothing but obscure histories and outdated travel guides. The eerie sense that I wasn't alone lingered as I skimmed through the pages. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow shift in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, no one was there. My heart started to race, but I pushed it aside, chalking it up to nerves. After all, I was in an old hotel in a quiet town. The wind, the creaks, and the floorboards, it all added to the atmosphere. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me, but then something happened that I couldn't ignore. It was late in the afternoon, the light beginning to fade, when I noticed it. The light in the hallway outside flickered, dimming slightly, as though the building itself were exhaling. The air grew colder, and I could hear faint whispers, as though the walls themselves were murmuring. My skin prickled. There was no one around, yet I could swear I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I froze, my mind racing. Who could it be? Had someone been walking up and down the hall all this time? I had never heard a sound like it before. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I cautiously opened the door to my room and peered out into the dim hallway. It was empty. No one in sight. The hallway stretched before me, silent and lifeless, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. But then I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps. Closer this time. I spun around, but still, there was no one there. I could feel my pulse quicken. There was something wrong here, something that couldn't be explained away by old wood and old floors. I had to find out what it was. The next morning, I approached Henry again, hoping to get some answers. I couldn't shake the image of his tight-lipped smile and the strange muttered words from the day before. Maybe he knew more about the hotel than he was letting on. I found him at the front desk, once again cleaning the same spot on the counter with a cloth, his gaze fixed somewhere far off, as though he was lost in thought. "Henry," I said, my voice a little more forceful than I intended. "I need to know more about this place. There's something wrong here." The door to my room was open, and I keep hearing strange things. People walking around. Whispers. His expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost imperceptible, like fear, or maybe just caution. He looked around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "You're hearing things, sir," he said, his voice quiet and deliberate. "This old place plays tricks on the mind. It's a century-old building. Old buildings do that." But there was something in his tone, something about the way he said it, that made me think he knew more than he was letting on. I pressed on, refusing to let it go. "Why does it feel like something's watching me? Like there's someone in the halls at night?" He sighed and glanced nervously over his shoulder. "You're not the first to feel that way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are stories, but it's best not to ask too many questions." "Stories?" I echoed, my curiosity piqued. "What kind of stories?" He didn't answer, just turned away, his back stiff. I was about to press him further when the door behind him creaked open. A guest, someone I hadn't seen before, walked in, and Henry quickly greeted them, signaling that our conversation was over. Frustrated, I left the desk and wandered the hotel, my thoughts consumed with what Henry had said. Stories. What stories? What was going on here? Later that evening, I took a walk around the property, hoping to clear my head. As I passed by the back of the hotel, I noticed a set of stairs leading down into a darkened basement. The door was cracked open just slightly, enough to make me curious. I hadn't seen this part of the hotel before. My pulse quickened as I approached the stairs, my instincts warning me to turn back. But something inside me urged me to go further. I stepped cautiously down the stairs, the air growing colder as I descended. The smell of dampness and decay hit me first, followed by a faint, metallic odor I couldn't place. The basement was far larger than I'd expected, and the walls seemed to stretch out endlessly in the low light. The floor was uneven, littered with old furniture and boxes. The farther I walked in, the heavier the air seemed to become, and I could swear I heard something, just on the edge of my hearing, like someone was breathing behind me. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, but the unease only deepened the longer I stood there. That's when I saw it something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, moving in the farthest corner of the basement. It was too quick for me to get a good look, but I knew what I had seen. I wasn't alone down there. I bolted back up the stairs, heart racing, and slammed the door shut behind me. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I needed to get out of that basement and away from that hotel. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was already watching me. I wasn't just being paranoid. Whatever it was that had been following me, had been waiting for me, was real. The night had fallen harder than I anticipated, the hotel's lights flickering dimly like broken stars in the distance. The heavy silence of the place was punctuated only by the occasional groan of the building settling into the earth beneath it, or the distant sound of the wind howling outside. My nerves were on edge, taut with the knowledge that something was terribly wrong. The whispers I'd heard earlier in the hallway echoed in my mind, a distorted symphony of voices that I couldn't place, yet knew all too well. I stood at the threshold of my room, the door slightly ajar. I had been in and out of it all day, each time feeling a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake off. Each creak of the door, every distant footstep in the hall, only served to heighten the tension, but it was the whispers low, guttural, like they were coming from the walls themselves, that kept me from relaxing, from feeling safe. I had spent the entire day trying to find some logical explanation for the strange events, the odd sounds, the eerie atmosphere, the inexplicable cold spots. I'd spoken to a few guests who had been there longer than I had, all of whom seemed unnervingly unaware of what was happening, though their eyes seemed to betray a shared knowledge they weren't willing to reveal. The staff, especially Henry, had been less than forthcoming. No one would answer my questions about the history of the hotel, the old rumors, or the strange occurrences. It was as though they were all caught in a strange pact of silence. The night was growing late, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my mind racing with questions. What was going on? Why did it feel as though I was being watched every moment? Why had the temperature dropped so suddenly in the last few hours? I couldn't get it out of my head. The shadow in the basement, the coldness that followed me around every corner, the footsteps that never seemed to stop. The hotel had become a living entity, its walls breathing, its floors pulsing with some kind of malignant energy. Then, as I sat there, the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was louder, clearer, and closer. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my door. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming, that I was trapped in some nightmarish trance. But the air felt too real, too thick, too cold for that. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers stopped suddenly, as though they were aware of my approach. I gripped the doorknob and twisted it slowly. The hallway stretched before me, dark and ominous, and yet I knew something was waiting. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The air was thick with tension. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling more than I would have liked. There was no answer, only silence. Yet I could feel the weight of a presence, like someone or something was watching me from the darkness. I stepped into the hallway, my eyes scanning every corner. The air felt heavy, as though I were walking through water, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting and curling like smoke. As I walked deeper into the hallway, I heard it again, footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from behind me. My pulse quickened, and I spun around, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice now firm with fear and frustration. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the impossible, but the only thing that made sense now was that I had to leave. I had to get out of the hotel before whatever was here found me. But just as I was about to retreat back to my room, a figure stepped into view at the far end of the hallway. I froze. It was a woman, pale, almost translucent in the dim light. Her hair was long and black, flowing wildly as though caught in an unseen wind. She wore a simple white dress, but it was tattered, stained with what looked like blood. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and they seemed to pierce right through me, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My heart skipped a beat. I had seen her before, at least. I thought I had. In the basement. The shadow that had moved just out of my reach. The figure I had seen out of the corner of my eye. But this time, there was no mistaking it. She was real. The woman took a step forward, and I took a step back, my body reacting before my mind could fully process what was happening. She didn't move like a normal person, though her steps were jerky, unnatural, as if her limbs were stiff, her body unwilling. And then she spoke. "Help me," she whispered, the words barely audible, as if they were being dragged from the depths of her throat. "They won't let me go." My breath caught in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, as though the very air had turned to ice around me. "Who?" I managed to ask, my voice hoarse. I didn't want to know the answer, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to understand what was happening, what I was seeing. Her eyes filled with a dark, unfathomable sadness. "Them. The ones who kept me here." The air grew colder still, and the woman's figure began to shimmer, her body blurring as if she were struggling to stay in one place, as though her very existence was being torn apart. The hallway around us seemed to warp and twist, the walls bending inward, closing in on me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, from the darkness behind her, another figure appeared. It was Henry, but he was different. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, and his mouth was twisted in a grotesque expression of pain. His skin was pale, almost lifeless, and his clothes were wrecked, as though he'd been dragged through hell itself. "You shouldn't have asked," he muttered, his voice hollow and broken. "You shouldn't have come here. Now you'll never leave." Before I could react, I felt a hand grab my arm, icy cold, and pull me backward. I whipped around, my pulse racing, but no one was there. It was as though the hotel itself had reached out to claim me, to drag me into the abyss with the others. And then the woman screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was a sound that tore through my very soul, a scream that echoed in the walls of the hotel, rattling the windows, shaking the floor beneath my feet. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate every fiber of my being. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Henry's twisted face, grinning as the woman vanished into the shadows. And then all went silent. I woke up to an overwhelming silence, my body cold and stiff. I was lying on the floor in my room, the bed a few feet away, as if I had been thrown there in the midst of the madness. My mind was clouded, disoriented, and the events of the past few hours flooded back into my consciousness like a nightmare I couldn't escape. My heart was still racing, but everything felt unreal. The memories of the woman in the hallway, Henry's twisted form, the horrifying scream that seemed to shake me to my very core, all seemed distant now, as if it had happened to someone else. But the feeling of dread hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened. I slowly pushed myself up off the floor, my legs trembling beneath me as I tried to steady myself. The cold was unbearable, almost as if the room itself had become part of the same chilling entity that haunted the halls. I looked around. The hotel, for all its unsettling aura, appeared undisturbed. The furniture was in place, the curtains drawn tight over the windows, and the light from the single bulb above cast long shadows against the walls. It felt like a normal hotel room, but I knew better. I had been through something here that no amount of rational explanation could undo. I checked the clock. It was only a few hours before dawn. Time seemed irrelevant, distorted in the wake of the horrors I had just witnessed. My first impulse was to leave, to get out of that cursed place, to never look back. But then the doubt crept in. Had what I experienced been real? Or had it been some kind of hallucination? The figures in the hallway, the coldness that seemed to pierce through my very bones, the way the hotel itself seemed to pulse with an ancient, malevolent energy, none of it made sense. My mind scrambled to make sense of it all, but no answers came. I stumbled to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. There was no sound in the hallway, no movement, nothing to indicate that anything was amiss. But I could feel it. The oppressive weight of something that wasn't quite right hung in the air like a thick fog. I needed answers. If I couldn't escape, maybe I could understand what was happening. Maybe I could make sense of this nightmare, and in doing so, free myself from whatever it was that had been haunting me. With that in mind, I made my way down the hallway again, more cautiously this time. Every step I took seemed to echo in the empty space, the sound reverberating off the walls in an almost mocking way. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few moments, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the same cold silence, thickening with each passing second. As I approached the stairs leading down to the lobby, I noticed something. The door to the basement was ajar. I hadn't seen it open before, but now it beckoned me like a dark invitation. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at it. The basement was where I had first felt that strange, oppressive presence, where I had seen the shadow that didn't quite belong. It was the source of all the fear that had gripped me since I'd arrived. I had to go down there. I had to confront whatever was waiting in the depths of the hotel. With every ounce of courage I could muster, I stepped toward the basement door. The air grew colder as I neared it, and I could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, the only sound in the otherwise silent hotel. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase, that descended into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I hesitated, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. The last time I had been down there, I hadn't been able to see anything clearly, but now I needed to understand. I needed to know. I grabbed the nearest flashlight from the hallway table and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness in front of me, revealing the stone walls of the basement, the damp floor, and the scattered debris that seemed to tell a story of neglect. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I descended, the beam of the flashlight flickering as if reacting to the tension in the air. Every step felt like an eternity, each one bringing me closer to the heart of the hotel's mystery. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam of light illuminated a room I had never seen before. It was small, cluttered with old furniture and forgotten objects, but there was something more. In the far corner, just barely visible in the dim light, was a large, ornate mirror. It was old, its frame intricately carved with symbols that I didn't recognize. The glass was cracked in several places, but the reflection in it seemed oddly sharp, as though the cracks didn't distort anything at all. My heart raced as I stepped closer. I felt drawn to the mirror, like it was calling to me, pulling me in. The whispers from before began again, faint but unmistakable. They came from the mirror. I felt a cold sweat form on my brow as I reached out a trembling hand to touch the glass. The instant my fingers brushed it, the world seemed to shift. The air thickened. The room around me felt like it was expanding and contracting, and I felt a pull of force that tried to drag me into the mirror itself. I stumbled back, gasping for air as the room seemed to return to normal. The whispers stopped. The coldness dissipated. I was left standing in the dimly lit basement, heart pounding, unable to process what I had just experienced. Had it been a vision? Had the mirror somehow allowed me to see beyond what was real? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that whatever had been haunting me was connected to this hotel, to its dark past, and to the cursed mirror in the basement. I took a step back, my mind spinning, and then I heard it, a low groan. It came from deep within the basement, from the walls, from the earth itself. It was as though the hotel was alive, and it was warning me to leave. I didn't need any more signs. I turned and ran back up the stairs, my body moving on instinct. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest I could barely hear my footsteps. I burst through the door to the main floor of the hotel and made my way toward the exit. The lobby was silent, as it always had been, but the weight in the air had shifted. It felt lighter, as though the oppressive energy had momentarily dissipated. I didn't look back as I pushed open the door and stepped into the cold night air. The moment I left the hotel, I felt the tension leave my body. The suffocating pressure that had followed me inside seemed to vanish the instant I was out of its reach. I never went back to the hotel. I don't know what happened to the others who stayed there, or if anyone else ever uncovered the truth about the woman I saw in the hallway or the mirror in the basement. All I know is that I walked away with unanswered questions, with a sense of dread that would linger in my mind for the rest of my life. The hotel still stands, a silent sentinel in the middle of nowhere, its doors locked, but its darkness waiting, just beyond the reach of the light. Some questions are never meant to be answered. Some places are better left unexplored, and some things should never be disturbed. The memories of that night, the fear, the tension, the feeling of something ancient and malevolent waiting in the shadows still haunt me. Even now, as I sit here reflecting on it, I feel that same unease creeping up my spine. It's been years since I walked away from that hotel, yet I can't shake the sensation that something followed me. I still have trouble looking into mirrors, and every time I pass an old building, I feel a brief tug of dread, as if the walls themselves are alive, watching, waiting. I've never spoken to anyone else about what happened that night. I don't know why. Maybe I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy. Or perhaps the memories are too much to share, too dark to bring into the light. People talk about ghost stories, the things that go bump in the night, but nothing could truly capture what I felt in that hotel. What I saw, what I felt, what I experienced, there's no way to put it into words that would make anyone believe. Maybe it's better that way. The hotel still stands, as far as I know. It's become a part of local lore, a place that travelers whisper about when they're in the area. Some say it's haunted, others say it's just an old building with a bit of a reputation. But deep down, I know the truth. I know what I felt in that place. I know the presence that watched me from the shadows, the history that bled through the cracks in the walls. There's something there, something beyond understanding, something that won't let go. I've heard rumors that people still go there, still wander its halls, despite the warnings. I've heard stories of those who stayed in that very same room I once occupied, and who felt the same chill in the air, heard the same eerie sounds, and even saw things they couldn't explain. Maybe the hotel is cursed, or maybe it's just a relic of something much darker, something older than we can comprehend. Maybe it's a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed, locked away in the past, where they belong. But there are days when I can't help but wonder, what if I hadn't left? What if I had stayed, tried to uncover more, learn more about the secrets that hotel held in its rotting walls? I can't answer those questions. I can't even say for certain whether my mind was playing tricks on me, whether I hallucinated the whole thing, or if there was something truly supernatural at play. But I do know this. Whatever it wasn't of this world. I try to avoid thinking about it too much, but there are nights when I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the house around me. I wonder if I'm being watched, if something is still lingering in the shadows, waiting for me to return. I never told anyone the full extent of what happened that night, not even my closest friends. What would they think? They wouldn't understand. They would dismiss it as stress, a bad dream, or something that was just in my head. But the truth is, the hotel left a mark on me. Not a physical mark, but something deeper. Something in my soul that can't be undone. It's as if I was touched by something beyond comprehension, something that doesn't belong in our world. And I can't shake the feeling that there's more to the story, that the hotel holds even darker secrets that I was lucky, perhaps too lucky, not to uncover. The one thing I do know is that I can't go back. I can't ever return to that place. It's as if stepping foot there once more would unravel whatever fragile piece I've managed to build for myself. There are some places you can't unvisit, some experiences that leave permanent scars. So I live my life, trying to move forward, trying to forget, but there's always that nagging thought in the back of my mind. I'll never forget the look in Henry's eyes as he stood there, twisted and deformed, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. I'll never forget the sensation of the cold, of the dark force pressing in from all sides. I'll never forget the reflection in the mirror, the cracked glass that seemed to hold the answer to everything, yet offered only more questions. And though I've never been back, sometimes, when I walk alone in the dark, I feel the unmistakable sensation that I'm not quite alone. Sometimes I hear a soft creak in the distance, or the faintest echo of a voice. But when I turn, there's nothing there. Nothing but the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge once again. The hotel, for all its isolation and mystery, never truly left me. It's always there, lingering in the corner of my mind, a reminder that some things, some places, should never be visited. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if the hotel is waiting for someone else, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to step into its grip and learn the truth. But I don't think I'll ever know, and maybe that's for the best. As I sit here, looking out at the quiet night, I can't help but feel that sense of closure, only to realize that it's not really closure at all. The hotel's story is still out there, lingering in the darkness, and it's a story that will never truly be finished. Not for me, not for anyone. It waits for the next curious soul to seek it out, to uncover its secrets. And when that person walks through the door, the cycle will begin anew. For me, though, I've learned my lesson. Some places are better left unknown. Some stories are better left untold. Some doors, once opened, should never be closed again. I used to laugh at the idea of abandoned train stations being anything more than eerie relics of the past. Just old bricks, steel tracks, and a bit of dust. But all that changed one cold autumn evening when I found myself standing at the edge of one such station. It was the kind of place most people would avoid, and for good reason. The station had been closed for years, long forgotten by commuters who once passed through its weathered walls. With only a few nearby houses and no major roads connecting to it, the station had become little more than a ghost in the shadows of a small town. But to me, it was the perfect setting for a quiet evening walk, a break from the monotony of my daily life. I lived in the city, working a 9-to-5 job that drained me more than I cared to admit. I'd never been one to shy away from adventure, but my days of reckless youth were behind me. I needed something different, something to break the routine. That's when I stumbled across a local article talking about the old station. It was just a piece on local history, nothing more than a footnote in the annals of the town's forgotten past. But something in it caught my attention. The place had always intrigued me, even as a child, though I had never dared venture there. So I made plans to visit. It was a Saturday evening when I finally decided to go. The weather had taken a turn that day. A light fog had begun to roll in from the coast, thickening as the evening progressed. Perfect for a night like this, I thought. With nothing but a flashlight and my old jacket, I headed out toward the station, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path as I made my way through the empty streets. The train station itself wasn't anything spectacular. The old brick building stood tall, but sagging with age, surrounded by overgrown weeds and trees that seemed to press in on the structure, as though nature itself was trying to reclaim it. The faded platform signs, long since unreadable, were still attached to the rusted poles that once stood proudly for travelers waiting to board their trains. As I approached the platform, I felt a strange unease begin to settle over me. It wasn't a sharp fear or anything that would make me turn back, but rather a subtle sense that something wasn't quite right. There was something in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, a quietness that made the world around me seem hollow, as if the station had absorbed every sound and replaced it with an eerie silence. I stood there for a moment, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, breathing in the cool air. Nothing seemed amiss, no strange sounds or flickering lights, just the peace that comes with being alone in an abandoned place. Yet, even as I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, at least not in the typical sense. It was more like something was waiting, watching me. As I stood near the edge of the platform, my gaze wandered toward the tracks. They stretched out into the distance, disappearing into the mist. The fog had thickened, and visibility was quickly dropping, but that wasn't what held my attention. No, it was something else entirely, a figure, just beyond the platform, near the old maintenance shed. It was difficult to make out at first, but I could swear I saw someone standing there, just outside the dim circle of my flashlight's beam. The figure was tall and thin, wearing something that looked like a long coat. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the mist played with shadows. But as my eyes adjusted, I knew something was wrong. I wasn't alone. My heart began to race as the figure seemed to move ever so slightly, like it was shifting position without making a sound. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears, louder than any footstep I had ever heard. But it was strange, there were no sounds. Not a single footstep, not a rustle of fabric, nothing to indicate that the figure was anything other than. Still, I stood frozen, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could react, the figure was gone, vanished into the fog, leaving no trace behind. My breath caught in my chest, and I turned around quickly, checking over my shoulder. Nothing. The platform, the tracks, everything was still. No one had walked past me. No one was standing nearby. The figure, whatever it was gone. I took a slow, shaky breath and tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had gripped me. It had to be my mind playing tricks, right? The fog, the silence, maybe I had imagined it all. I turned to leave, but just as I started walking back down the platform, I heard a soft, distant sound like the rattle of old train wheels on the tracks. It was faint at first, but as I listened, it grew louder, closer. It was as though something or someone was moving toward me, just out of sight, but getting nearer by the second. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew right then that whatever I had encountered on that platform was far from normal. Something was waiting for me in the shadows, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was, but I knew I had no choice. I had already walked too far into the unknown. I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The fog, which had been thickening with each passing moment, seemed to envelop the entire platform, closing in on me like a blanket. My hand still clutched the flashlight, its beam now shaking as my pulse raced in my chest. I glanced around again, half expecting to see the figure reappear, standing just beyond the reach of my light, but the platform was empty. The tracks, silent. The air, thick with nothing but the damp chill that seemed to seep into my bones. Was I imagining things? I took a few cautious steps back, my eyes scanning every inch of the platform, from the rusted old benches to the crumbling station building at the far end. My mind raced to explain what I had seen. Perhaps it was just an optical illusion caused by the shifting fog. After all, mist can play tricks on the eyes, especially in places like this, where time seems to stand still. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I knew something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched, the figure that had vanished without a trace, it all felt too real to be a mere figment of my imagination. I took another step back, my boots crunching on the gravel, and decided it was time to leave. This wasn't what I had signed up for. A simple walk, some fresh air, and a glimpse of an old station, nothing more. But the unease that had settled in my stomach refused to let me go. As I turned to leave, my flashlight flickered. At first, I thought it was just the battery dying, but it wasn't that. The light flickered in a way that felt deliberate, as if something was interfering with its beam. I cursed under my breath and tried to twist the flashlight's cap tighter. But the flickering didn't stop. It was as though the darkness itself was pushing against the light. I quickly turned it off and on again, hoping it would settle. But when I did, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a figure in the distance, standing near the old ticket booth, barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Was it the same figure from before? The one near the shed? No, this one was different. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure was not only standing still, but seemed to be watching me. It was much closer than before, its outline more defined in the dim light. The coat, once a vague shadow, now seemed to have substance, though I couldn't make out any features. It was almost as though the person, or whatever it was wearing a long, heavy coat that covered most of their body. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, yet the tension in the air became unbearable. My throat tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I took a few steps forward, trying to get a better look, my flashlight still flickering intermittently. With every step, the figure seemed to shift just out of reach, its outline distorting with the fog. It was like playing a game of cat and mouse, but I wasn't sure who was hunting whom. "Hello," I called out, my voice betraying the unease I felt deep within. It was a stupid thing to do, I knew that, but I couldn't just leave without finding out what was going on. The fog seemed to swallow my words, the silence that followed pressing in on me like a weight. There was no answer, only the cold air and the eerie stillness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for a response that never came. The figure didn't move. It was as if time had frozen, leaving us locked in this strange, silent moment. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was another visitor to the station, someone who had come out here just like me, seeking solitude or some sort of adventure. But the longer I looked at the figure, the more I felt that this was something different. Something was off. The way it stood there, unmoving, was unnatural. No normal person would stand like that in such a desolate, abandoned place, especially not at this time of night, with the mist thick enough to cut through with a knife. I felt a chill run down my spine as I took another step back, my eyes never leaving the figure. The moment I moved, it seemed to shift again, but this time I was ready. I quickly turned and began walking back toward the entrance of the station, my mind racing. Was I just seeing things? My breath was quick, shallow, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence around me. But as I walked, I heard something else. A low, almost imperceptible sound that came from behind me, the shuffle of footsteps on gravel. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I spun around, expecting to see the figure right behind me, but the platform was still empty. The train tracks stretched out into the fog, but there was nothing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Had I heard that sound, or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Maybe it was just the wind. After all, I had heard stories of the strange way sound traveled in places like this, how it could play tricks on your ears, making you believe you were hearing things that weren't there. But even as I tried to calm myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. I turned back and hurriedly made my way down the gravel path toward the exit of the station. The fog seemed to have grown thicker, and the air was heavier than before, as though the atmosphere itself was pressing in on me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever had been there, whatever had followed me, was still there, just waiting for me to make one wrong move. I reached the edge of the platform and stepped off onto the gravel path leading back to the street. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. My footsteps quickened, and I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look over my shoulder. I was nearly halfway down the path when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, quick and deliberate, following me from behind. My stomach dropped. This time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I turned around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The path was empty. The station, silent. I stood frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. My legs felt like lead, my body too heavy to move. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The sound of footsteps had been real. I had heard them, and now the station was as still as it had been when I first arrived. But in the back of my mind, I knew I had seen something I couldn't explain, something that wasn't human. As I walked away from the station, the fog began to lift slightly, the feeling of being pursued slowly fading. But the unease remained, creeping in the back of my mind, gnawing at me, telling me I hadn't seen the last of whatever had been waiting there. The days that followed the encounter at the station were restless. No matter how hard I tried to shake off the unease that had settled deep in my bones, it lingered like an old friend who overstayed their welcome. The incident at the abandoned train station kept replaying in my mind, each detail vivid and haunting. The figure, the footsteps, the overwhelming sense of being watched. They wouldn't let me go. I tried to push it all aside, telling myself it was nothing more than a trick of the mind, the kind of thing that happens when you wander too far into forgotten places. But the more I tried to forget, the more the memories came rushing back, like a tide that wouldn't recede. Then, one evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the station once again. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something I had intended to do. But there I was, staring at the rusted tracks in the distance, the station's silhouette looming in the fog like a forgotten relic from another time. I hadn't told anyone about the strange things I'd experienced, not out of fear of being judged, but because I couldn't find the words to explain it. How could I? How could anyone understand what it felt like to stand on a desolate platform, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on you? No one would believe me, and I wasn't sure if I believed myself. But now, standing there once more, something felt different. The fog was thicker than it had been that night, so dense that it seemed to swallow the world around me. The sound of my boots on the gravel was muffled, and the air hung heavy with moisture. I couldn't see past a few feet in front of me. It was the perfect setting for things to go wrong. I'd come back to find answers. But the more I looked around, the more I realized I didn't want answers. I wanted to leave, to turn around and walk back to my car and forget the whole thing. But something kept pulling me forward. It wasn't until I reached the platform that I began to hear it again, the faint rustling of footsteps in the distance. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were too rhythmic, too deliberate to be an accident. This time, however, I was ready. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick fog, its flicker echoing the unease in my gut. I scanned the platform, the tracks, the ticket booth, the old benches. Nothing. The station was empty, just as it had been before, but the sound of the footsteps didn't stop. They were closer now. The sound grew louder, closer, like something or someone was walking toward me, moving with purpose. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but once again, I found nothing. Just fog. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized that the footsteps were not coming from behind me. They were coming from ahead, from the direction of the platform. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. This couldn't be happening. I had to be imagining it. I was losing my mind. Then, as if on cue, the figure appeared. This time, there was no mistaking it. The same figure I had seen before, standing just beyond the flickering light of my flashlight. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right there, standing at the edge of the platform, its form barely visible through the fog. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were stuck in place, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure stood motionless, just as it had before, its outline blurred by the thick mist, but its presence undeniable. It was almost as if it had been waiting for me. A wave of panic washed over me, and I backed up instinctively. My heart pounded, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I turned and began to walk quickly down the platform, my legs unsteady beneath me. My mind was racing, my pulse thundering in my ears. What was this thing? What did it want? And why was it following me? I had to get out of there. But no matter how fast I walked, no matter how quickly I tried to put distance between myself and the station, the figure seemed to be with me. The footsteps, the soft shuffle of movement followed me, just out of reach. The sound grew louder with every step I took, as though it was mirroring my movements. I glanced over my shoulder, but the figure was gone. The platform was empty once again, the fog thick enough to obscure anything beyond a few feet in front of me. But the footsteps were still there. They were close now, so close I could almost feel the presence behind me. The sound of them had grown impossibly loud, like a heartbeat thudding in my ears. I couldn't take it anymore. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the gravel, my breath coming in desperate, gasping breaths. The fog seemed to close in around me, and the footsteps followed, relentless, never stopping. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. When I finally managed to get inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart was racing, my entire body trembling. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the more I thought about it, the more the reality of it sank in. There had been something there, something following me, something I couldn't explain. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and without a second thought, I sped away from the station, my eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. The fog seemed to dissipate as I drove, the tension slowly fading as I put more and more distance between myself and that cursed place. But the strange thing was, the further I drove, the more the feeling of being watched grew. It wasn't just the station anymore. It felt like whatever had been there was following me, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't go back to normal life, knowing that something was out there, something that wasn't human, something that was clearly trying to make its presence known. The fear that had followed me all the way back to my car hadn't faded, it had grown stronger, and I knew I had to go back. I couldn't just leave it like this. That night, as I lay in bed, trying to forget the chilling events of the evening, a new thought took root in my mind. What if I wasn't just being followed by some ghostly figure? What if there was more to this station, more to this haunting than I could possibly understand? I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stop until I got them. The night was uncomfortably quiet as I sat alone in my room, my mind unable to rest. After everything that had happened at the abandoned station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn back there. The strange events, the figure, the footsteps, nothing about it felt natural. It was as if something beyond my understanding was happening, something that I needed to confront. I had been researching the station relentlessly, trying to find some clue, some shred of information that might explain what I'd seen and heard. But all I could find were vague references to the station's history, a few mentions of it being closed down years ago after a fatal accident. It was rumored to be haunted, but that didn't explain what had happened to me. It didn't explain the way I had felt, the way the presence had seemed so real, so tangible. I couldn't keep pretending it was just in my head. That afternoon, I made up my mind. I would go back. This time, I wouldn't leave until I understood what was going on. The air outside felt heavy, charged, like the calm before a storm. The day had been overcast, the sun barely visible behind thick clouds. As I drove through the winding roads leading to the station, the familiar feeling of dread began to creep back in, clawing in my mind. But this time, I wasn't going to run. I couldn't. The station appeared through the mist, just as it had before, but now there was a new heaviness to it. The tracks were rusted and overgrown, the buildings in disrepair. Everything looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, but there was something more feeling that lingered in the air, like a presence that had been waiting for me. I parked the car, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The silence outside was suffocating, and for the first time, I felt the weight of what I was about to face. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out onto the gravel. The air was cool and thick, the fog swirling around me in waves. My flashlight flickered on, casting an eerie glow on the darkened platform. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were here. I walked toward the station, the footsteps of my boots crunching on the gravel, each step sounding louder than the last. The station loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, like a creature waiting to devour me. As I approached the platform, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. The first sign that something was wrong was the sudden cold. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was a sharp, biting cold that made my breath fog in the air. I glanced around, but the fog was so thick I couldn't see beyond a few feet. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt like the entire world had paused, holding its breath. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. It was the same rhythmic sound I had heard before, but this time it was closer, much closer. It came from the end of the platform, and I knew in my gut that whatever it wasn't human. I froze. My body went numb, as if the very air had turned to stone, making it impossible to move. The footsteps grew louder, the crunch of gravel unmistakable, echoing in the otherwise dead silence. I raised my flashlight, scanning the platform, but I couldn't see anything. The light barely cut through the thick fog, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything it touched. Then, through the mist, I saw it. The figure. It was standing at the far end of the platform, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was tall, dressed in what appeared to be an old, tattered coat, the edges of it frayed and worn. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the fog, right at me. It was as if it knew I was there, waiting, watching. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mouth went dry. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but my body refused to cooperate. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, from the way it stood so still, like a statue, yet so alive in its presence. It wasn't just a shadow, a trick of the light. It was something real, something terrifying. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I had to confront it. I had come all this way for answers, and I wasn't leaving until I had them. Who are you? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hoarse and shaky. There was no response, just the steady thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. I stepped forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run as fast as I could, but I couldn't. I had to know what this thing was. I had to know why it was here. As I moved closer, the figure's form began to shift. It wasn't just standing anymore, it was moving, slowly, deliberately, gliding toward me like a shadow that was too real to be just that. It was as if the very air around it bent, twisted, pulling it toward me with an unnatural force. I froze again, the cold intensifying, sinking into my bones. My feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, watching as the figure drew closer and closer. And then, it spoke. The voice was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was clear, unmistakable. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. The words were like a cold, sharp knife cutting through the air, each syllable heavy with an emotion I couldn't place: anger, regret, sorrow. But there was something else too, something far darker, deeper. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The fear that gripped me was suffocating, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in the presence of something that wasn't bound by the same rules of nature that we were. The figure stopped just a few feet in front of me, and I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. My body trembled, my legs like jelly beneath me. It wasn't just fear I was feeling now, it was something far worse. The air around me felt wrong, like the world was shifting, bending, and I was being caught in its pull. Why? I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though it was considering my question, then took a step closer. I could feel its gaze now, heavy and suffocating, drilling into me. My chest tightened, my breath shallow and quick. "You're too late," it said, its voice barely more than a breath. Before I could react, it moved again, and this time I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek. The touch was light, but it sent a shock through my body, like electricity coursing through my veins. I staggered back, my heart racing, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. The figure didn't follow me this time. It stood there, watching me, waiting, as though it had accomplished its purpose. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the figure, feeling the weight of its gaze on me like a physical force. The darkness around me seemed to close in, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the thick fog as though it had never been there at all. I was left standing there, my breath ragged, my mind reeling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I had come here for answers, but all I had found was more questions, more fear. My body was still shaking as I turned to leave the platform, the fog swallowing me whole as I hurried back to my car. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something had changed, and whatever had been waiting for me at that station was still out there, watching, waiting. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. I didn't remember getting in my car, didn't recall how I even started the engine. It felt like I was operating on autopilot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, replaying the encounter with the figure over and over again. I couldn't make sense of it. Every time I tried, the details slipped away like water through my fingers. What had I just experienced? Was it real? Was I losing my mind? I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just the culmination of too many late nights of research, too many hours spent thinking about the station and its history. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the isolation and the stress. But something deep inside me told me that I was wrong. I had seen it, felt it. That thing, whatever it was, had been real. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of my building, I was still shaking, but my mind was eerily clear. My body had gone numb, like I was operating on some kind of primal survival instinct. I didn't even want to go inside, but there was no escaping it now. The darkness that had settled into my mind wasn't going to disappear just because I walked through the door. I walked up the stairs to my apartment, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the hallway. Everything felt too quiet, too still. I didn't even notice the time pass as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It wasn't until I closed the door behind me that I realized just how much the silence weighed on me. I wasn't alone in this place anymore. The feeling from the station had followed me back, lingering in the corners of my apartment, watching, waiting. I sank down onto my couch, my eyes scanning the room like a paranoid animal. The light flickered above me, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and stretch. Every sound, every creak of the building felt like it was some kind of omen. I had escaped the station, but I was no longer sure if I had truly left it behind. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure again, the dark, tall shape looming at the end of the platform, its eyes watching me like a predator sizing up its prey. I could still feel its presence pressing on my chest, suffocating me, and I knew deep down that it wasn't over. It wasn't just something that had happened at the station. It had followed me. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but there was no denying the truth. That thing, whatever it was still out there. I could feel it in the air, in the way the room seemed to shift around me, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little bit longer. By morning, I was exhausted. My mind was heavy, clouded with the memory of what I had seen. But there was something else too, a sense of urgency, a feeling that I needed to go back to the station to finish whatever it was I had started. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the compulsion. I tried to tell myself that it was a bad idea, that I should just forget about it, leave the past behind, and move on. But the more I resisted, the stronger the pull became. The figure had given me a warning, but it hadn't stopped me. In fact, it had only fueled my desire to understand what was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't go back, if I didn't face it again, I would never find peace. By the time I had gathered the courage to head back to the station, it was late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast, the wind picking up as dark clouds gathered overhead. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the calm before a storm, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was a sign of what was to come. I parked my car near the entrance of the station again, the same spot as before, and sat there for a long moment, just staring at the darkened platform. The air was thick with tension, and the place seemed even more desolate than I remembered. The fog had returned, swirling around the abandoned tracks like a living entity, obscuring everything in its path. I stepped out of the car and hesitated, unsure of what to expect. I was so deep in my own thoughts that I almost didn't hear it at first, the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. The same sound I had heard before, the one that had sent a chill through my spine. I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing there, no figure, no shadow, just the station, silent and still. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the platform, my boots crunching on the gravel. The fog closed in around me, swallowing the world whole, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. As I reached the platform, I stopped, scanning the area for any sign of the figure. There was nothing. No movement, just an unsettling stillness. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Maybe I was expecting something to jump out at me to confirm my worst fears. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that it was the emptiness that was the most terrifying thing of all. Whatever had been here before was gone. Or maybe it had never been here at all. The idea that I might have imagined everything, the figure, the footsteps, the cold touch on my cheek, seemed impossible now. I had seen it. I had felt it. But now there was nothing. Just the fog, the silence, and the abandoned station, stretching on into the distance. I felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with confusion. Maybe I had just been chasing shadows all along. Maybe it was all just a trick of the mind, a manifestation of my own fear. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In the distance, at the far end of the platform, I saw it, a figure standing still, just like before. But this time, I didn't approach. This time, I didn't move toward it. I turned and ran. My heart hammered in my chest as I sprinted back to the car, not looking back until I had slammed the door shut. I started the engine and drove away without a second thought, the station fading into the distance behind me. I didn't return after that. I didn't want to. Whatever had been haunting that place, whatever I had seen, it was no longer something I was willing to face. I had come looking for answers, but all I had found was more questions, more fear. The figure, the station, the strange events, they were all still with me, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts. And yet, even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that the figure, whatever it was, is still out there, waiting for me to return. I try to tell myself that it was all in my head, that the station was just a place, just an abandoned building with a tragic history. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that we don't understand, things that we can't explain. And some of them are far more real than we're willing to admit. For now, I can only hope that whatever it was, whatever I encountered at that station, is content to leave me alone. The passing years have only deepened the mystery that began at that forgotten train station. Life went on for me in the usual way. I found distractions in the small things. A new job, a new apartment, friends and relationships that offered me comfort from the haunting thought that I could never fully escape what I had experienced. But even as I tried to move on, the memories clung to me like a shadow. Every now and then, I'd find myself staring out the window of my apartment late at night, the city lights stretching out before me. But the stillness in the air would feel too much like the eerie quiet that had surrounded me at the station. I'd think about it, wonder if I'd ever truly be free of it. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the strangest sensation that I wasn't alone in the room. That feeling of being watched like a figure, or something worse, was lurking just outside my field of vision. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I had no real proof that anything had ever happened. The station had been abandoned for years before I ever set foot there. The figure I'd seen it could have been my imagination, my mind's way of processing all the strange history I had uncovered. Or maybe it was just the cumulative stress of working on a project that had consumed me. I had heard of people seeing things, experiencing strange events, when they were under pressure or dealing with emotional strain. That was the story I clung to. But in my heart, I knew better. Sometimes I still dream about the station, about that fog-cloaked platform and the tall, shadowy figure. The dreams are vivid, unsettling, and always leave me with a lingering unease when I wake. They don't happen every night, but when they do, they feel too real, too familiar. I never went back to that place though. Not physically, at least. I had no desire to confront whatever it was that had greeted me there. As much as I wanted answers, I realized that some mysteries were better left unsolved. Some things weren't meant to be understood. Maybe the station had been abandoned for a reason. Maybe it wasn't just the building that was forgotten, but something darker, something tied to the land, or to the very essence of what had happened there long ago. I'd heard rumors of accidents, disappearances, and unexplainable deaths linked to the station, but I'd stopped digging into them. The answers, if they were even out there, were buried too deep for me to uncover. Despite all of this, I still wonder. What was the figure I saw? What was the purpose of the strange events that seemed to escalate as soon as I set foot in that place? Why had it singled me out? Was it trying to warn me, or was it just playing some kind of cruel game? I don't know if I'll ever find the answers, and at this point, I'm not sure I want to. Some questions, I've come to understand, are meant to stay unanswered. The people who live in that town now, if the station is even still standing, may never know the strange history that lingers there. And that's probably for the best. Some places hold a memory, a presence, that can't be washed away by time or neglect. The station is one of those places. It has a life of its own now, a life that exists in the space between the living and the dead. Sometimes, when the wind picks up in the evening and the air feels heavy with the weight of things unsaid, I can still hear the faint echo of footsteps in the distance. I know that it's just my mind playing tricks again, but I can't shake the feeling that something is waiting for me. I've long since stopped looking over my shoulder or checking the corners of dark rooms for shadowy figures. But every so often, when the night is still and the world is quiet, I feel the presence of something just beyond my reach, just beyond the veil of what we understand. I've tried to live my life since that night, tried to put the past behind me. I've kept my distance from places like the station, abandoned buildings, isolated locations that have a history of their own. I don't seek out the darkness anymore. I've learned that some things are best left alone, and some experiences, no matter how terrifying, are not meant to be relived. But the thing about fear is that it doesn't always leave. It lingers in the back of your mind, tucked away in the corners of your thoughts, resurfacing when you least expect it. It's been years since I encountered that figure, and yet I still remember it vividly. I can still see the figure standing at the end of the platform, its form twisted in the shadows, its eyes gleaming with an intensity that I can't forget. Even now, the image is burned into my memory, like a brand that refuses to fade. I don't know what happened that night, and I'm not sure I ever will. But one thing I know for certain is this. Whatever it was, it's not gone. It's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it, to stumble upon the forgotten station and make the mistake of uncovering its secrets. Maybe one day, someone will go searching for answers the way I did. Maybe they'll find the same darkness, the same chilling presence, waiting for them in the fog. As for me, I'll never forget. I don't want to. Even though I try to move on, to live my life and forget what happened, there's a part of me that is still tethered to that moment. still connected to that station in ways I can't explain.